Yeah.
All right, we'll give it a couple more minutes, Warner, before I kick it off to you.
Okay. And I'm okay on volume at this point? Sophie? Is that a thumbs up?
Yep, you're good.
All right. I might toggle just to make sure that I'm clear on my.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Violet.
Violet.
Good morning, Violet.
Good morning. I'm Warner Chabot. I'm the executive director of the San Francisco Estuary Institute. I'm honored to be asked to welcome you all here joining us today for the Bay Planning Coalition's Fall Summit. As you know, the coalition's mission is to provide expert advocacy and facilitation to advance a strong economy that supports a sustainable environment within San Francisco Bay and its watershed. The next 2 hours, our two panels and experts are going to explore the Bay Area's enormous climate adaptation challenge. We're going to focus on two areas: planning strategies to address the challenges and funding options to finance solutions. I want to first acknowledge the hard work of the coalition team that coordinated today's summit. And that includes CEO John Coleman, policy associates Sophie Douglas and Cameron Carr, and all supported by board president Laura Kennedy. We also acknowledge the generous support of Bay Planning Coalition sponsors and in the agenda, who's listed in the agenda in the resource packet. For today's program, I'll set the stage. Ms. Allison Brooks, the executive director of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, or BARC, will then moderate a panel of experts on climate adaptation and planning strategies. After a short break, Eric Saperstein, the president of ENS Resources, will update us on federal programs and policies that may support our regional efforts. Mr. Dilip Trivedi, the vice president of Moffitt & Nichol, will then lead a panel on funding options. In conclusion, the Bay Planning Coalition board president, Laura Kennedy, will then offer some closing remarks. So let's get started. For this morning's, I think we need a reality check and understand that what we're seeing in Florida is almost an example of the types of challenges that the nation and many coastal areas are going to face, especially if they have policy leaders that encourage development in hazardous areas. On a more upbeat note, let's acknowledge that basically we do live in paradise. Many, but not all experts agree that about 15,000 years ago, the first humans crossed the Aleutian Island land bridge into what's now Alaska. So for about 14 and a half centuries, those people voted with their feet on where to live in North America. So about 500 years ago, 14 and a half centuries later, when Mr. Columbus landed on a Caribbean island, one of the most densely populated areas in the entire North America was the greater Bay Area, what's now sort of Santa Rosa to Sacramento to Monterey. Why? Well, we have spectacular temperate climate, unimaginable natural resources. We who were born here were very lucky. We live on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone, the Coast and the Bay Miwok, and the Patwin tribes, many of who resided here for thousands of years before us. They lived a culture that maintained and enhanced the biological diversity of the region. So here's the challenge for us. We're almost 8 million people literally living in a very large bathtub, and the water's rising. With climate change accelerating faster than we imagined possible a few years ago, I'd like to suggest a goal for all of us who, for not only just for those who preceded us, but also for our grandkids. And that is that the Bay Area should become a national model for how an urban region of 8 million people at the edge of the sea tackle climate change with hope and vision. I further suggest that we consider 3 ambitious challenges to our panelists and to all of those of you who are working on climate adaptation efforts. One is that we move with great speed and scale. Two, that we make bold financing investments. And three, that we keep equity foremost in our values. We need to tackle urban heat and adjacent wildfires, algal blooms and red tides, the triple threat of rising seas, rising groundwater, and lowland flooding from more extreme storms. Please remember that decades of racial injustice exemplified by redlining restricted both private and public investments in lower income, more racially diverse shoreline communities. Those underserved communities are now the ones most vulnerable to climate change. In the next year, our planners, in the last year, our planners produced several regional plans to deal with and begin to adapt to climate change. BCDC produced the Bay Adapt, MTC ABAG produced the Plan Bay Area 2050. By the end of next year, 2023, our agencies intend to inventory and prioritize the needed infrastructure investments to address approximately 5 feet of rising seas expected in the decades ahead. That's why we need to accelerate the scale and the speed of planning strategies and be bold in our funding strategies. Just for example, over 2 decades ago, we set a goal of preserving 100,000 acres of bay wetlands. So far, we're about 1/3 of the way towards that goal. We also recognize that sea level rise is going to start to accelerate around 2035. So we have to, like in the next dozen years, double the amount of wetlands restoration that we've achieved in the last 2 decades. Earlier this year, SFEI released our sediment for survival report. We focused on how much sediment we'll need to supplement nature's supply so that our bay wetlands rise to keep pace with sea level rise. We estimated that nature will supply about 1/3 of what we need, but it's going to require us to find about 300 million cubic yards of sediment from dredging and upland sources. Depending on your assumptions, that cost to supply that additional sediment is somewhere in the $3 to $20 billion range. So we also recently had a red tide algal bloom. We're going to need in the next 20 years or 10 years to start thinking about how do we improve not only the water treatment exiting from our 40+ water treatment plants around the Bay Area, but how are we going to deal with a water supply issue with a reduced snowpack? That's going to be a cost factor somewhere in the multi-billion dollars. Overall, I predict that by the end of next year, I won't be surprised if the cost of rebuilding our infrastructure over the next 20 years to get us to the end of the century is somewhere about $100 billion. I think that we need to make sure that we do this with both speed and urgency and scale, that we need to look at bold financing solutions, and that we need to do it with a mindset towards equity. We need to tackle all of these issues and speed it up. So I think we have quite a challenge ahead of us. I look forward to the advice and direction that we are going to get from the panelists who are about to present to us. I do recognize, and one of the things that gives me hope is the quality and caliber of leaders in the Bay Area. I would say if there's one thing that gives me hope, it's the women of the Bay Area. Every meeting that I go to around climate adaptation is about 3/4 female. When I look at about 2 weeks ago, there was a celebration in Richmond. That was the 50th anniversary. And the 3 primary speakers were Yana Garcia, the head of California Department EPA, Martha Guzman, the regional administrator of the federal EPA, and Radhika Fox, a local leader who is now the deputy administrator for water. 3 women of color that are at prominent positions of leadership. I do think we have a tremendous amount of leadership in the Bay Area. Just last week, I sat in on a meeting that was chaired by Violet Sena that indicated a commitment by a good number of the community-based organizations to collaborate around how they are going to work together collectively to deal with climate adaptation in the Bay Area. We're looking at the fact that between the federal government and the state government over the last couple of years, they've made major commitments for climate adaptation and infrastructure. If we get our fair share of the allocated funds, there'll be several $billion that will come to the Bay Area. As I said previously, I think part of our challenge is how to avoid a food fight between the 100 cities, the 9 counties, and the 100 community-based organizations who will all be trying to secure some of those funds to implement some of the programs going forward. I do believe that a high priority for our region is going to be how do we make sure that we work collectively, strategically, to make the proper investments that recognize the fact that about 90% of climate adaptation is land use planning, and about 90% of land use planning still occurs at the city and county level. So how are we going to coordinate across all the counties, all the cities, to meet the needs of local communities while also considering investments that meet the regional needs of climate adaptation, and recognize that we have ignored and underinvested in those low-lying, underserved communities who will literally be hit the hardest by climate adaptation. And what are we going to do, those of us who are on this call that have resources and I consider to be at the grass tops level, what are we going to be doing to try to open doors and engage and be supportive of community-based organizations and nonprofits that are working on the front lines to help build their capacity and ensure their engagement in future efforts. So I am very excited about the leadership that I see in the community. I would suggest that rather than having someone like me do an introduction at the next meeting, someone like Violet Santa, a local community leader, should be the type of person that should be talking to you about where are we at and where are we going. So with that, I'm going to shut up and welcome everybody and go to, I think, our first panel. John, do you want to introduce the next?
Sure, just real quick. First, Warner, thank you so much for providing the opening remarks and asking a lot of good questions. It's really important. I'm going to introduce Allison Brooks, who's the Executive Director of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, and she's going to talk about the planning strategies. One thing that we wanted to make sure that we did versus the Spring Summit, we did not have adequate time for our participants and panelists to talk. Today's is many of the same people, and we're making sure that we have adequate time for dialogue between the panelists and participants. With that, I'm going to be quiet and hand it off to Allison.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the introduction, Warner. My job is easy here, really, today. I've been tasked with moderating a conversation among a great set of experts. As John mentioned, a lot of the folks on this panel today were part of a conversation at the Spring Summit. And I like this idea of bringing forward kind of that conversation and picking up where we left off and talking about more deeply talking about planning strategies along the lines of some of the ideas that Warner put together. We are also benefited by having Violet Santa join us today from Climate Resilient Communities, also helping to staff BayCan in the Bay Area region as well. So we're going to talk about planning strategies from different scales. We're going to start kind of at the regional scale, and we're going to drill down into the local community from people that are operating from different perspectives on this issue around adaptation, and how are we ultimately helping our cities across the Bay and our communities across the Bay manage risk to climate hazards and become more resilient and equitably resilient moving forward. So I'm going to basically stop there. We're going to hopefully have some time. You're going to hear first from Amy Worth, then you'll hear who is the chair of, not only just the chair of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, she's a long time member and leader on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and of course, mayor of Orinda and a longtime leader in Contra Costa County as well and beyond. So we'll hear from Amy, then we'll hear from Len Matterman from One Shoreline in San Mateo County, Roger Leventhal, who with Marin County Public Works, Courtney Bell, a developer with Prologis, and then we won't end, but we'll close with Violet Santa from Climate Resilient Communities. So with that, I'll hand it over to Amy Worth, my chair, and then we'll go from there. Amy?
Great. Well, Allison, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I just wanted to follow up on a couple of Warner's comments. First of all, Warner, you're wonderful to recognize the women involved in this. I think when I look back, I think we're really just following in the footsteps of our great heroes, Sylvia McLaughlin and Kay Kerr and Esther Gellick. But also, I was thinking of Rachel Carson, and these are women who really brought these environmental issues to the forefront. They took them out of the boardrooms, out of the academic, towers, into people's everyday lives as a child growing up. I remember reading Rachel Carson, and I don't know, they published a Rachel Carson Silent Spring edition for children. And I remember my mother reading that to us when we were children. And so it is, it's so important for us to do regional planning. I think as Warner indicated, 101 cities, nine counties, 27 transit agencies, federal, state, regional agencies, all have a big stake in the future of the Bay Area. And as we, talk about, we gather together around the Bay, literally and figuratively. These efforts are so important to bring people together. And when in preparing for today, I really have spent a lot of time thinking over the last 4 months of our program last spring and the comments from the participants and some of the takeaways. First of all, the recognition that a lot of the work is being done by local jurisdictions, many small, some large, but all in need because of the technical aspect of Bay planning, sea level rise, new methodologies for climate adaptation. What kind of technical assistance and financial support can we give to those cities? The second piece is, again, coming from the standpoint of regional government, how do we work to eliminate conflicting regulations? For example, this conflict between water and air. Sometimes VMT goals can be, when you look about investing in bicycle and pedestrian pathways, how do you make sure that those don't conflict with water goals in terms of regulations, and be able to have the resources to build out our active transportation network? The other thing is we need to really target our federal and state funding advocacy efforts. And this is probably one of the hardest things to do, because everybody has got their priority projects, and how do you recognize what can compete? How do we set up a structure for identifying the whole Bay and outlining what are our priority projects and how do we move forward so that all these projects get done, but we're really able to compete at the federal and the state level for funding. And it is extremely challenging to do that. And the other thing that we talked about, and I'm so grateful to be able to work with Allison, because we need to coordinate the work plans of the regional, state agencies as they apply to resiliency. And one of the things, it takes individuals who are willing to sit down at the table and work together. And sometimes it's sharing territory, it's sharing authority. And we're so fortunate to have Allison Brooks leading this effort through the executive director, being the executive director of the Bay Area Collaborative, because you have a person, she's very, open, inviting, and she has worked. I've seen this over the last few years, working so effectively with all of the regional and state agencies that are here in the Bay to sit down and really say, how can we coordinate our work? How can we work together? And just by expanding BARC to include the state and some of the regional agencies that weren't originally part of that, is a real focus on the Bay and resiliency. So I think that, what we found too is that doing good planning is essential. But we also need to figure out how to get the work done. So last spring, I presented to you, and I am mindful of the time. So please give me a handle on how much time I have, because I know we have a panel. I don't want to go on too long and want to make time for questions. We started out with this plan that we adopted, the Bay Area, the BARC and the regional agencies, the plan with the 3 initiatives to develop the multi-regional multi-hazard adaptation plan. The second piece of that is develop the regional climate adaptation technical assistance plan for cities. And the third piece is the zero emission transit bus infrastructure. So we're now at the point where we're drilling down to the next phase of that. And how do we last week we made the first step of developing the specific work plan so that and we're very fortunate because all the agencies that are engaged in this are buying into this process as we move forward. And it really is going to take the cooperation and engagement and collaboration of all of our regional and local agencies to be able to deliver a plan that truly is transformative. So I think that as we go through this process, we are looking to start with an inventory of where we are and the important work that we're going to need to be able to provide data and guidance so that local jurisdictions don't have to figure this out on their own. The technical assistance, just like ABAG provided cities for the regional housing needs allocation process, we've seen the fruits of technical assistance. When local jurisdictions are provided with technical assistance, which on their own they can't afford and don't have access to, the fruits of that effort is really significant. So that's the first thing. The second thing, capacity building. How can we provide the support to our most vulnerable frontline communities? And Warner talked about the equity elements in this plan, which are so important because those are the communities that are really significantly impacted by whether it's sea level rise or air quality issues. How do we look at all these initiatives with a heavy focus on equity? And finally, for an overall vision, how do all these plans fit together? Again, I think that we are blessed in that we have so many agencies and individuals that are focused on the goal of the Bay, of both through Plan Bay Area 2050, which looks at initiatives to moving forward to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to develop in sustainable ways, but also working together in terms of mitigation. We just heard about the grant that Nevada received, just was in the paper yesterday, and this news is rolling out. I'm really encouraged because I think the next generation, as a grandmother of a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, the next generation is very eager to be engaged and help the environment. They love the earth. The 4-year-olds, it's just great to see the young people so engaged. And that's, I think, one of our other initiatives. So with that, I just want to close that I'm really looking forward to answering any questions that our audience has today.
Thank you so much, Chairworth. And to that point about the questions, we see I've acknowledged a question that was posed by Damien, and we'll come back to those as but first we're going to hear from all our speakers, and the speakers should be mindful of see some of the questions and feel free to weigh in on those in your presentations as well. So next up, we're going to have Len Matterman from One Shoreline. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I will start to share screen right now. And hopefully you can see a slide. Let's start with that one. Can you see that okay?
Yep, we can.
Okay, super. Okay, so thank you. My name is Len Matterman. I run a special district created by state legislation. We were established effective January 1, 2020, so a little over 2.5 years. San Mateo County-wide, it's called the Flood and Sea Level Rise Resilience District. We also go by the short name of one shoreline. San Mateo County, and I'm going to go through this super quick because I know we want to focus in on the questions and answers at the end, and we were asked to do 5 minutes, so I'll be racing through this. First 3 feet of sea level rise, the most vulnerable county in California. The 2 images on the left are actually about 3/4 of a mile upstream of the bay, so it's quite a distance, and sea level rise on sunny days, like the middle picture, causes flooding, and high tides do. So transformative issue for our county, and we weren't well positioned to address it. So state legislation created us to deal with the water-related impacts of climate change. That includes flooding, sea level rise, Pacific coastal erosion, stormwater, water supply, recreation and environment, holistic view to the threats, meaning all these various threats from climate change, not just traditional, let's say, quote unquote, flood control, a holistic view to the geography. All of our work is multi-jurisdictional with the understanding that no city can address it by itself, and a holistic view to the objectives, including protection, recreation, environment, all that. So the scale of this challenge requires a response of appropriate scale and cohesiveness. And we look for solutions that address the multiple climate concerns in the key sectors of our society. So not just us as government and planners and public works people, but looking to partner with businesses and community-based organizations. And we can talk about that. Also cross-disciplinary, not thinking of this as just a water issue or just a smoke issue or just a wildfire issue, but looking at the major sectors of society because they're all impacted by climate, where we site housing. And there's a lot of pressure to site more housing, but where we site it and how we site it is super important. Also our transportation networks and our energy and other utilities. Okay, so key ingredients for long-term resilience from our perspective. So the first key ingredient is local leadership that is eager to use its authority to maximize opportunities for long-term resistance. It may not be urgent to build sea level rise protection right now, but it is urgent that while the shoreline is being shaped by development, that we now lock in space, land rights, begin design and secure permits, because all of that takes time. And so we worked with the city of Burlingame on the first zoning ordinance in the Bay Area to address and have requirements related to sea level rise. And we're now working with other cities in San Mateo County, including San Carlos, San Mateo, and South San Francisco on their key planning documents, the general plans, specific plans, zoning ordinances. Another key ingredient is cross-jurisdictional effort that's layered upon this planning. We have a project that I talked about in May in the cities of Millbrae and Burlingame, south of San Francisco International Airport, to guide and integrate developments into a aligned regional solution. All of the purple areas in that map are major new developments that are coming online just in the city of Burlingame right now. And when I say coming online, they're in different stages of the approval process. The idea is that this project would tie into San Francisco Airport's shoreline protection program. They recently released a draft EIR about a month ago, and I think comments are due within the next 3 or 4 weeks. You might want to take a look at that program. That's a major effort as well. And then opportunities for new development. This is the third key ingredient. Developments that can contribute to both their site-specific resilience, but also be part of the regional resilience. The images that we have here on the bottom, on the left is East Palo Alto, and it shows homes in that little circle on the left of the image. It also shows PG&E huge towers. That's in the bottom circle. And then the SFPUC water infrastructure to bring Hetch Hetchy water into the peninsula. All of that is obviously along the shoreline. The bay is just to the right, and it's all unprotected. And so this is not just about homes or commercial real estate. It's also about our major infrastructure. But you do have homes that are built right on the shoreline. You see this image in the middle from Redwood City, and you think about with sea level rise, how is this property supposed to be protected other than put a wall right at its front door? And that's the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid by providing setbacks and just planning integrating planning for sea level rise and other climate hazards into these developments. So we're working with developers and cities and BCDC on projects in the cities listed here right now to fulfill our basic premise. What we build today is intended to function for decades, during which time the impacts of climate change we know will grow. So shouldn't projects be designed to function under those foreseeable future conditions? We think wholeheartedly the answer is yes. And so we're pushing this as hard as we can. We are developing a climate resilience planning guidance policy for general plans and specific plans and zoning ordinances, as well as development approvals. And it's a policy that our board will put out for the entire Bay Shoreline, which is 53 miles long in San Mateo County. And it will be a resource for cities and the county and special districts as they plan their assets and other private assets within their jurisdictions. Some of the things that it would include are, as I mentioned before, setbacks and easements for flood protection, recreation, habitat, elevation, and other standards for both protection infrastructure and for the buildings and infrastructure. How to finance resilience, and I think we'll talk about more of that later today, as well as disclosure related to finance, disclosure of climate-driven hazards in real estate transactions. This was a requirement in the Burlingame zoning ordinance, and we think it's important to acknowledge those hazards going forward for future conditions. And then finally, stormwater capture. A lot of cities are dealing with stormwater issues on a regular basis. This is a long-standing, expensive issue. And are there opportunities on a regional basis to capture stormwater? And in terms of drainage, site the stormwater drainage in a way that it actually can function during sea level rise. A lot of the stormwater facilities aren't able to do that. And of course, they end at the bay, which is rising. And then finally dealing with groundwater rise. And there's a lot of work being done, good work, to understand the impacts of groundwater. Overview of our draft guiding principles and objectives for our projects. The beneficiary share responsibility, protecting against multiple climate threats, and far into the future, our assumption for what the bay will look like when we have our design standards is 10 feet above today's high tide. So it's an aggressive level. It matches kind of one of the highest assumptions that the Coastal Commission is using on the ocean side. And we think that that should be matched on the bay side. Also to keep, but maybe modify our critical assets. Don't just maintain what's there now, of course, enhance trails and close gaps. In ecosystems, make them self-sustainable and diverse to thrive in a changed environment, and enable our permits to value that, because right now that's not where the permitting regime is at, but really look for our ecosystems to thrive in the future. And then in terms of working with nature, with climate change, we're going to have to fight nature enough as it is. Let's look for ways to minimize that and to resulting long-term, and also minimize the resulting long-term maintenance costs, energy, and other financial impacts. And there are good examples of that we could talk about. And then finally, this is what the San Mateo County Bay Shoreline looks like. The green areas are shoreline areas where we are coordinating on projects that are in various stages of planning, design, or construction. And the red areas are not just aligned. So our job is to try to align this very complex shoreline with projects that exist and some that will exist in the future. And then finally, kind of touching on that question in the chat, Allison mentioned, we think that the best way to ensure that underserved communities are not left behind is by bringing everybody along together in projects that align multiple jurisdictions, so that you have underserved and over-resourced or well-resourced communities within the context of the same project, and that their protection is aligned, and we move forward in that way. So I'll stop there and turn it back to the next speaker, or Allison. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you mind commenting, since you did jump in on some of the comments, Christina Hill had a question for you around the groundwater problems and how you're addressing that in your work.
Well, as I said, it's kind of an emerging, we collectively, I think, have an emerging understanding of the impacts of groundwater And so our design teams are well aware of that issue and looking for the best science. And I think Christina and some of the other folks that are working on this right now will help to inform our project. So I can't say that we have a particular study that's our baseline and what we're using for design right now, because I think it's a somewhat dynamic issue, and I think all of us are just coming to terms with it. But it's super important, and in some cases subsidence, which is a somewhat related problem, and intrusion of salt water. So there are a lot of issues that are maybe underground and under the radar that we all should be focused on.
Great, thanks, Lynn.
Sure.
Thanks. It's exciting to see the progress made in San Mateo County under your leadership, and I think it's interesting to talk about how we need to be focused on development. We have a lot of needs, and I'm hoping we can delve into this a little bit later in our conversation, but how as a region do we kind of embrace all the needs we have around housing and around the continued need for development, but also recognizing these are locations where they require a different approach and different kind of building standards and codes and investments beyond kind of the typical way we've done development in the past. With that, I'm going to hand it over to someone who probably thinks about this a fair amount from a public works perspective, and that is Roger Leventhal. So welcome, Roger.
Hello. Thank you. I think Sophie is going to do my slides. Yeah. So Roger Leventhal, I work for Marin, but also representing Charge, which to remind everyone is it's the group of public flood agencies that ring the bay that are responsible for providing flood protection, and especially focusing on the developed urban edge. And so my agency, Len, and several others are part of the Charge group. Next slide. Next. There you go. So today we talked about, just thought it was like a series of updated thoughts since the spring conference for today. So in no particular order, I guess, well, we didn't solve sea level rise or climate change in spring. So here we are back in fall. My next thought was that I think when we should expand our, when we talk about sea level rise projects, or we should, I think, start at least talking about two different groups, if not more, and say that there's the majority of the projects been talked about, like the Belmar Keys project and such, are really habitat projects that maybe have a flood protection element added onto the back as required, usually for CEQA. As opposed to another type that we don't fund as much, but also I think we need to raise up, is the idea of the flood protection projects, using nature-based solutions where possible, but also acknowledging that they're, and I'm speaking as someone who's built a lot of wetlands and beaches and such, they damp waves, but they don't necessarily stop sea level rise. So there's going to need to be projects, if we're going to protect the urban edge in its current location, circa 2022, that are really flood protection first. So I think as we talk about sea level rise, let's start dividing at least into these two broad categories. Again, Charge focuses on protection of communities. I think there's nothing more local than your local DPW, because we have to deal with everybody trying to get permits, the people that live there. We're completely focused and 100% agree with the great work done by SFBRA and the Conservancy on working with local communities and how important that is. I think in my experience, sometimes that's harder. It's easier said, and there's a lot of people in a community that don't go to public meetings that are still there, but aren't as involved. They're obviously have kids or they have other things going on. So I think, working towards those solutions is going to be quite a challenge. Keep going. Another thought is funding, I think, is more uncertain into the future. I'm not as sanguine, I think, that the funding, and I think some of the numbers Werner threw out, actually, I would consider to be low. Because when you build a levee, then you need to pump behind it. And if we're going to talk now about groundwater pumping, that's a different system than, say, stormwater pumping. They can coexist, but it's a whole different way of pumping. And so I think ultimately the funding, and anyone who's moved a yard of dirt understands how difficult that is, the impacts, and we're talking about necessarily needing to move a lot. So I think we have a big funding challenge. And so I think cost effectiveness needs to matter. And the permitting process can't keep adding to that. As a local agency, a lot of what we do is going to have to be grant funded. So we need to really focus on ways to reduce that. And I agree with Werner's that we need a rational process, keep going. Boy, the time goes quick. Keep going. So charge is right now, we're writing white papers to help kind of, I would call it sea level rise for engineers, but written for planners and decision makers. We're hoping to get those out in 2023. I want to touch a little now about engineering with nature, kind of what that means, because it's become front and center to everything. It's interesting that it's having it's a big part of what grants are now and everything. So the next slide shows quickly, it's a spectrum too. There's the conventional engineering, and then everything else from green, gray over to natural is considered nature-based engineering with nature, according to the Corps. I think, the San Francisco seawall maybe fits in that, that box of the green and gray. That's where a lot of we're going to be working, I think, in. And then, but we don't want to confuse those necessarily with a lot of the work we're doing and others are doing. Like in Marin, we're doing a lot with beaches and wetlands, which are more to the right. So again, I think our vocabulary needs to reflect the fact that we can't just lump everything, as I think often does, into this one rubric of design or engineer with nature, because it is a spectrum across that. So final slide, the next one. So just the real world and issues that I've run across dealing with this, and this is a whole other talk, but just for now, requires more space, often not available around the urban edge. Yeah. Liability is an issue. If we're going to hire someone, if we're going to be doing these things outside of parks or actually projects that will need to protect people and could fail, we need this, we need a new liability thing if we're going to get people to stamp and do these or more demonstration of proof. Keep going. Next. Money, it's easier to find construction money than maintenance, which is a common issue with, at least with a lot of the beach stuff I'm doing. We're gonna have to maintain these projects over time, and finding those funds is harder. I think the permitting costs are higher due to the uncertainty. And this, the last bullet is, engineering with nature really does require, I think, taking more risks. And so we're all for it in conjunction with traditional engineering, but understanding the difficulties. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Roger. I know it's a lot to try to fit into 5 minutes, but we'll have time in the conversation for questions, and maybe you can kind of surface some of the other points that you didn't quite expound upon in your presentation. So thanks so much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Courtney Bell from Prologis Europe. Courtney.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Courtney Bell. I'm the Director of Development at Prologis, bringing a little bit of the private side development perspective here, and really excited to be here. I've been at the company for 2.5 years. I manage acquisitions, due diligence, and entitlements for projects in California, and I mainly focus on multi-story design and urban infill markets. So you can go to the next slide, Sophie. So I thought I'd share one of our top priority initiatives that we're working on planning at Prologis. We're really focused on, we've always been committed to leading the industry in sustainable design. And we recently have expanded bold commitments to achieve net zero emissions globally by 2040 as a company, which is really exciting. You can go to the next slide. So as owners and developers of real estate, one of the levers that we have to pull to really contribute is the design and construction of our development projects. We've committed to carbon neutral construction and to deploy 1 gigawatt of on-site solar with storage, both by 2025. We obviously own the design and construction process of these facilities. So we're in a unique position to help drive architects and engineers and contractors to really push the envelope and utilize innovative strategies for sustainable design. The overall goal being to reduce embodied carbon and the overall emissions footprint. And you can see here some of the design elements, but industrial and logistics facilities have, are constantly adapting and are more advanced than ever before. So we are always trying to stay ahead of our customers so we can deliver value. And we really see our role as helping our customers achieve their sustainability targets. So in order to execute on this vision, we really need to collaborate and plan with our customers, industry partners, communities, and jurisdictions where we operate. So if you go to the next slide, I'll share a little bit of details on one of the projects that I'm currently working on. It's highlighted here in kind of the bluish green, located in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco. The site is bifurcated by Highway 280. If you go to the next slide, it's actually a really innovative multi-story design. Oh, could you go to the next slide? I don't know if it's stuck, but I can't see it.
Did it load? Is it on the
No, his slide has not changed.
It hasn't changed yet.
okay, weird. It's changed on mine. It's probably my Wi-Fi. Let me.
There you go. There you
Oh
go.
yeah.
Just
Okay.
taking a second there. So yeah, I think it's skipping now. But it's an innovative multi-story design with 3 levels of PDR space. It's really designed to be flexible and adapt to users over time. And it has vertical circulation throughout the buildings, and you'll see here with an active rooftop with parking and rooftop solar array, generating a significant amount of renewable energy on site. So if you go to the next slide, really what the team has thought about in terms of project objectives is to really, speak to the opportunity that we see in creating alignment between the community, the city, and customers, particularly as it relates to jobs, resiliency, and innovative sustainable design. Kind of, we've been talking about this as more of a regional plan, but this is, how we can try to incorporate these concepts at a project level. So if you go to the next slide, 2 of the major design features of the project are a 3.2 megawatt solar array and electric vehicle charging infrastructure that goes beyond San Francisco's minimum EV code requirements. It includes 4 levels of EV charging infrastructure across all vehicle types. And so we're trying to think about ways to plan ahead and plan for future, and those definitely take some time to collaborate both with the community and with our jurisdiction to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to deliver on those design features. If you go to the next slide, it just quickly talks that we don't run the operations or fleets, but we aim to really serve our customers' needs, and we see our role as helping to facilitate the transition to fleet electrification. And we really do that by investing in the charging infrastructure in our real estate portfolio. So we really see, in order to actually achieve that, we need a partnership with government and utilities, both locally and regionally, to make that happen. And what's particularly exciting about these types of projects and multi-story design in these infill locations is really the ability to provide scale. Both investing in PDR jobs, particularly in San Francisco, that have been historically lost to other uses, and for testing and investing in new technology related to renewable energy solutions and electrification. So happy to answer any questions during our panel discussion and Q&A, and thanks for having me, Allison.
Oh, thanks, Courtney. That's great. I just really like this panel a lot because, we have people just operating at different scales, as, I talked about at the beginning, and it's just everybody kind of has to think about a different set of details, but it all needs to come together, all the way down to the project and all the way, certainly working in partnership with the community. So with that, everyone should be encouraged, please provide more questions, because Violet's going to close this out in terms of the presentations, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. So Violet, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you everyone for having me today. I'm gonna start my timer just so I can time myself. Again, my name is Violet Saena, and I'm the Executive Director of Climate Resilient Communities, a community-based organization serving frontline communities in San Mateo County. And we've also started a program to work with communities in Santa Clara County. I saw some questions around how to ensure community participation or community engagement and being at the table. So I wanted to start my talk this morning just focusing on one of the projects that we have. And this is to really look at supporting planning, adaptation, supporting the communities to be at the table. And our main focus, as we have seen a lot of the previous presentations, we're talking about regional strategies, strategies to reduce vulnerabilities from direct exposure to sea level rise. For CRC, or climate resilient communities, our main focus is the people, the community, the ability of communities to adapt to climate change and sea level rise. So a lot of our programming focuses on building their coping capacity. As I have worked in the communities for a long time, a lot of the conversations that I have with communities and residents is that how can we plan, or how can we be prepared for climate change if we don't understand the issues, we don't understand our risk and the risks to their livelihoods. So when we started the work, and some of you may, I know a lot of planners here, like, how do you engage the community? Let me just say and share with you that there needs to be a lot of work that needs to take place before even getting the community at the table, talking to you about climate change and working with you to prioritize adaptation. And one of the main common things that we have found is that there is no institution, existing infrastructure, and I'm going to call this human infrastructure. Community leaders want to engage. They want to be at the table, but they don't know how. They don't know how to organize. And so one of the things that we had to build with our work in East Palo Alto, and I'm going to share this from East Palo Alto's project, is that we had to build an infrastructure, a climate change community team that we call it, where business leaders, faith-based leaders, residents, even our future generation, our youth, were at the table making decisions and taking a lead to coordinate climate change work. And this is something that we had to build for East Palo Alto, a climate change community team, so that their capacity is increased, or ability to plan with projects and with the city. And so you need institution, infrastructure to do that. Also, you need to provide a lot of capacity building. I heard Amy this morning talking about how can we build our community capacity. So one of the responses that I can say is that look into where the existing CBOs or community-based organizations are working, and you have to build their capacity first so that they can then build the communities that they work with to bring them at the table. It's a lot of work, and I'm telling you this to share with you that, there's a lot of work in the initial, you have to put a lot of effort to build these infrastructures and community leadership and partnership to be able to, for the community to engage fully to the plan, fully with you on any projects that you bring to the table. And then meaningful engagement. And I want to shed a light on this because a lot of projects, in my experience, like I get emails from developers like inviting me to come to a meeting because they are proposing a project. And this is like maybe a year or 2 years into the project. A lot of the communities want to be involved in the beginning. They want to be with you from the beginning of the project to the end. And to do that, sometimes I hear, a lot of it, the reality is you have to do a lot of work to build that trust. And I heard something about we have to move fast to build this. Yes, that's true. But also with the community work, you have to move with speed of trust, meaning that you can't just rush the community to get where you want to be with your project, because at the end, it will give you a lot of disadvantage situation. Next slide, please. My 5 minutes over already. So this is an example of a focus group. One of the engaging the community, like I said, with our project, because East Palo Alto is a very diverse community. We have majority are Latinx or Spanish speaking community. We also have a high percentage of Pacific Islanders. So we try and provide a program that is more inclusive to engage everybody in the process. Next slide, please. And then if you are listening to the communities, these are the kind of projects that they come up with, the projects that they prioritize. As I mentioned, like in East Palo Alto, there was limited awareness on climate change and the impacts of climate change on their community. There is limited or no emergency preparedness program. They want more education and more effective communication to the community. And as you see, this is one of the results that we gathered from one of the project that we did in East Palo Alto. Next slide, please. And so if you engage the community in these conversations, this is the list of projects that we have right now. And most of these projects were developed with the community. We have a pilot rain garden project that is funded by Coastal Conservancy. And this is a project to address flooding in East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto not only vulnerable from the San Francisco Joint Power Authority, the San Francisco Creek, which Len Matterman led a project that protect them from that fluvial flooding, but also they are vulnerable to intense rainfall. So the rain garden and the water cistern project came out of those community engagements. We have a new project with Resilient Hubs. This is another project that was prioritized by the community. We have coastal restoration projects funded by Measure AA, also a project that was identified by the community. So as you can see, all the projects existing projects that are community led in East Palo Alto are mostly projects that, it's all about nature. It's the community prioritizing nature as a buffer, or as restoring nature as a way of helping them to respond to climate change. And then Safer Bay project, this is another project where the community, the climate change community team are the advisory committee to this project. So this is how that participation and the community being at the table, and they will serve this project well because of their capacity has been built over the past years. And then I'm going to end with, last slide, please. Yes. This is my information. I know this was very fast. I apologize for going over 2 minutes. Feel free to reach out if you want to learn more about our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Violet. Great. Well, that was excellent. And I think a key word that you mentioned a few times was funding, resources. I think, and I guess, we got a lot of questions in the chat and some are very specific, but let me just follow up with one with you. Could you talk a little bit more? You receive funding through your organization, say, to work with Safer Bay, with San Francisco Creek. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of works? Like how as an organization, what your role is, what the role that resources play, and how you tie in with, say, some of the consultants that are part, like the more technical consultants that are part of the project, what the nature of that partnership looks like. I think it would be instructive, this discussion around you being brought in early. What does that look like? How should it work?
Yeah, great. The Safer Bay project that you're referring to, it's a great example because we were involved at different stages, and then even like putting together the proposal, like we talked about how I was always advocating, let's have the community at the table. Let's, bring them, be part of the project. And because we had built the climate change community team, people, like we have community leaders with now the expertise to engage and to advise. And so working with San Francisco Joint Power Authority, Margaret and Tess, on proposals to include community engagement. And then part of that community engagement is like coming up with strategies. How can we, have the community voices be part of this? And so that's how we have, so it's funding, it's crucial right? Because from a CPO or community leader, we have to compensate our communities for their time and their expertise. And so I'm at the table with Margaret and Tess, putting together these numbers where, you know, what is the appropriate compensation? What else do we need? So there's a lot of funding that needs to make this happen. And which is why when I'm looking at a budget and I see community engagement funding 10,000, I'm not going to say yes to that, because it does cost more, because we want to engage the communities at every level. And so every time we have to be mindful of their time and also the expertise that we are getting from them putting these projects together.
Great.
It's like any other consultant coming in and doing the job, right?
Yeah, and you build, as you noted, you built your expertise over time. So it shouldn't just be a one-off, you know, it's something the community has the capacity now to kind of be that expert partner.
Yes.
And bring that expertise. So, and that's something we need to be supporting and cultivating all across the Bay in these communities. Yes, Amy.
Allison, I just wanted to add on, and Violet, thank you for your presentation, because after I finished and we started looking at the questions, I started jotting down some comments, and you took care of so much of it in terms of showing, you know, the work that your group has done in terms of community engagement, communities of concern that are able to, you know, equity priority communities that are able to have projects and engagement. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have in local government, is reaching out and engaging our communities. You know, so many of the people that we want to engage in this discussion and dialogue, they're working full-time to live in the Bay Area. They're working multiple jobs. They're raising children. Whatever they're doing, it's how can we reach out and bring their perspective to the table. And it's so important. You know, all of our meetings are open and they're public, but they're often, it's a challenge for people to engage. And I looked at a lot of the projects. I think it's important to note that we, in terms of, you know, equity priority communities around the Bay Area, we placed a priority on that at MTC in terms of funding. So various funding sources to fund actual projects. Yesterday, I was over on the Contra Costa shoreline, looking at the initiatives that in Rodeo, Hercules, and then North Richmond. And if you want to get a really good idea of projects that focus on equity priority communities, the projects that you can see, and it's a beautiful map and then description in the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority projects, because many of those were put together with not only a functional lens of where we need to be doing climate, you know, bay restoration using, you know, the best technology to do it, but in terms of you know, equity priority areas, communities that are in those areas. And I look at the Richmond shoreline as a good example of that, and where we are able to combine not only bay shoreline restoration and dealing with some of the structural issues around stormwater and wastewater and those areas, but also enhance the recreational opportunities for those communities. So I would give a big shout out for the Bay Trail and the importance of that as a Bay resource as we look to not only provide programs that benefit our equity priority communities, but also that enhance in terms of not only some of the structural issues, but in terms of bay rise mitigation, but really in terms of recreation and opportunities that exist around the Bay, that we want to make sure that all those communities are able to experience and enjoy. And I know that's a lot of the work that you're working on in the South Bay when we're working to complete those links. So
thanks, Amy. I'm going to shift us and we'll come back around to this issue, but we had some very specific questions for Courtney that I thought getting back into the Q&A, and we'll come back around to kind of some other questions around process and how everybody's participating in a regional conversation around problem solving around this. But I don't know if you saw some of the questions for you, Courtney, if you want to weigh in on those around the charging. There was a lot of questions about the charging and electric charging infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Allison. I saw a couple questions related to, I think, kind of what we're talking about here is planning for these infrastructure investments. And to answer the first question for the EV charging stations at the particular project, yes, we're trying to connect kind of all the dots. So the renewable energy that we're trying to generate on site would filter to be utilized by those electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So it's definitely kind of a dance to figure out how much you can generate on site and then use for the charging. I mentioned earlier that there is, minimum requirements for electric vehicle and in San Francisco, and we're trying to exceed that, and currently just in conceptual design to figure out how much we can use that would be offset by what is generated on site. But then a question came up, I think, from Margaret was, as a developer, what kinds of requirements and expectations are we trying to encourage more of from our municipal partners? And one of the things that really comes to mind is planning at kind of the time scale of what we're trying to achieve from development. We want to invest in this infrastructure like the solar and electric vehicles. And for this particular project in San Francisco, it's at a scale that has not really been done before. And so if there's further insight into the approval process and clarity and commitments in terms of how we can secure that power, how we can plan for the investments in solar and EV, that really is helpful for us to be able to figure out how and when and kind of put all the puzzle pieces together. And this kind of factors into the third question that I think was in there was, building homes near businesses, and really can the electric vehicles reduce emissions? And part of the reason why these kind of all filter together is, yes, just kind of like putting in everything at as much as we can in electric is a big change in terms of emissions. But what's really also driving a positive impact is what we see is locating these facilities in different locations. So it's trying to consolidate the supply chain network. Historically, in particular in the Bay Area, you have regional distribution, then you have kind of Bay Area distribution, and then you have last mile. So if you can locate these types of facilities where goods and services need to be closer to customers, it allows you to consolidate that, reduce vehicles in terms of the trip length, and reduce the types of vehicles, the more larger scale, diesel powered trucks that it's easier to kind of go to the smaller vehicle types, which have higher adoption for electric vehicles anyway. So it's kind of all, I guess, pieces of the puzzle together.
Yeah, thank you. And that happens at the local level, but a lot of what we're talking about around just broadly electrification of our buildings and our transportation infrastructure takes a regional scale approach and some thought, and sub-regional, and kind of all these scales. I always get really caught up in the scale issue, which is illustrative of what we're talking about today, because at every scale matters, and every scale needs to be kind of resourced and thinking about all these things. So I'm going to shift this over to Roger. Roger, you had a few questions as well. The first one, an anonymous attendee would like you to expand upon the two types of the SLR sea level rise projects that you mentioned. Have you found it challenging to have both a habitat first and a flood protection first project?
Yeah, I was just getting at the point that we talk about these things without having a distinction, and there really is one. So to try to get a grant, it certainly matters. So the ones SFBRA is funded, and other agencies are really habitat projects, and you typically might have a sea level rise or a flood element. In fact, you look at this horizontal levee, it's the levee part that really provides the flood control, and then the horizontal part maybe provides some habitat. So I just wanted to say, I think that though there's a lot of areas, and maybe it's worthy of another distinction we're having in this call, is, it's one thing to talk about redevelopment or development in new areas. That's a lot easier. Anyone who's ever done a DIY project like plumbing, like I'm doing now, hell of a lot easier to start from scratch than to try to fit things in. So, when you have a well-heeled developer, like, we have here in San Mateo, and they have the money in the millions to sort of do a development and build a wall right there, that's great. But my point is just that there's thousands of homes that are up creeks and right along the bay up tidal creeks that don't have that. So we're not going to be, unless we're going to do massive redevelopment using eminent domain and other things, that we're going to have, that's maybe the harder situations to get at. And so some of those are going to require just plain old boring flood control, pipes and pumps. And a lot of what I do is urban flood control, and there is no nature-based pump option. I wish I could think of one. Maybe if I make them look like pufferfish or something, I could then, get some grant. So it's like, you're always in this push and pull, like boring old flood control is really hard to get funded. So that was really my distinction. So let's not lump them all together and say that we're accomplishing everything, I mean, I'm trying to be good here because Sophia looked at the first panel and said I was kind of the Debbie Downer, and so, which is fair, because it's true. Like, I think when you're at the bottom of the hill dealing with this issues on the ground level, it's hard not to be. So I want to be positive and say I think we can do all this, but I think I'm pushing back against, maybe it's my role of sort of vague magical thinking. Because let's be really clear that we're having a big discussion, but the word the limits of engineering and retreat and things haven't come up, and when we're going to not be able to provide protection. And the harder issues, I think, are still there. And just to ramble one more minute, I personally think that, what to say that there are just limits. Well, probably we need to talk about what the limits of engineering are, what we want to do before we have to make some other changes and have those kinds of maybe the harder discussions. But if we are going to hold the line, then I think a lot of we're talking about, we're going to need that kind of levee system, which requires not just the levee, but the pumps and et cetera, and the electrical behind it. So I hope that's clear. There's just trying to break things down a little bit so that it's less of a, just for the public understands that it's a complicated, very, very complicated. We're trying to do one of the world's biggest flood control projects in a lot of ways. And we should probably maybe make that very visible, I think.
Well, what you're describing, I think it gets to some of the other questions that I'm navigating in the Q&A. Great questions, everyone. This is some of the best questions I've seen in a Q&A, so it speaks a lot to the group. But you're describing how hard this is. You mentioned earlier, there's the capital project. Sometimes it's really easy to, this is true in transportation too, and a lot of things, it's easy, I say that, I don't say that lightly, to get capital money, but then how do we do the operations and maintenance? And how are we going to do operations and maintenance in changing conditions too? And these are just big challenges. And it gets me back to one of the first questions, which was largely around a process question of, well, I think we kind of lost it, but like as a region, how are we all going to work together to kind of solve this? What is the system for doing that? I mean, I have my own perspective. I'm charged with helping to coordinate 7 regional agencies who work with cities and counties across the Bay, but I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on how we set up a process where we're laying out all the challenges. We need to be kind of lay those out on the table and understand the complexities and the pros and cons. And this is true, Violet, from one of the questions in here was around some other places around the country are doing this a lot faster. And, I love your move with the speed of trust. How are other places around the country or other places doing this more quickly? What are they getting right? Or what do you see working in other places around this speed of trust? Because it's not just around community members. I think there's largely a lot of issues around trust working across agencies and across organizations. And how do we, each of your perspectives on how we build up or accelerate the speed of trust, maybe? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Allison. I think what's happening, and this is my own experience and in the spaces that I'm working in, I think a lot before we have been working in silos, right? There's, like Amy had talked about, different jurisdictions. How can we come together and, like make things easier for us so that we can move faster where we need to be? But I think because a lot of the time in the past, we've everyone is charged with this And that's like we're not connecting, and the same feeling that the communities felt too, like they were excluded. Like we see projects coming in and not engaged in any way. But I also believe that right now, you know, with some hope, is that, you know, I saw a question about PCDC policies. I think there is a movement to the right direction. I mean, I'm also part of PCDC environment, you know, EJ committee. And what I see from that experience is that a lot of the change has to happen from inside as well, right? We, like I said, we need to change the, you know, shake things around. And what we're doing with my advisors there is like, you know, sharing with PCDC, you know, where the change needs to happen, what kind of, because we bring in the perspectives of the community. So us being part of that, the community voices and the community perspective is included. And so that's part of our job in that. The other change that I've also seen, which I'm also engaged in, is the BayCan network. That's another great example of a region moving towards the right direction. I think with BayCan, you know, with all the members, which include government, cities, counties, down to CPOs, which we're building our CPO community, that's inclusion, right? Before you have to bring people, again, back to the conversation around how do you bring people to the table, you know, and how do you prioritize that? And I think it's like paying attention and do a lot of listening to, and I'm speaking to a lot of you here who are heading a lot of these big agencies that you have the power of resources. Like for us CPOs, we're waiting to see when it's going to trickle down. But what we're asking for is like, have us at the table, hear where our needs are so that the communities are being prepared. Again, it's not just the exposure or the shoreline. A lot of our communities are vulnerable because of their existing coping capacities. As Warren mentioned wonderfully this morning, like communities that have faced decades of racial injustice. And so those are the issues we have to deal first with before they are able to adapt, be able to flourish and move forward with all the other places that was mentioned in the question. Thank you.
Does anyone else have a comment on that question, want to weigh in on?
I mean, the only thing I'd say, I think we have an issue. I mean, if you look at where things have been successfully done, you go back to the Dutch, maybe, and you would say they have a very different approach. It's a very mission-driven, top-down approach. So they're going to protect, and if your farm's in the way or your house, they're going to take it, they're going to pay for it. But it's a very different approach. I mean, I'm just a dumb engineer. I'm not politically that savvy, but this is based on my reading. And then we're talking about a very different philosophy here, a very bottom-up, community-driven approach. So I see it as kind of maybe we have to work both ends, but you know, Marin is full of different jurisdictions. We can't get people, I mean, every district, there's so many districts. It's really hard for us to work across because everybody has different missions. So I don't really know. I think if it's, maybe there's somewhere both ends will give something, but I think I see it as an issue to be really resolved.
Okay. Oh, we'll start with Amy and then we'll go to Lynn.
Great. Well, thanks, Allison. You know, just picking up on those comments and Violet's work in her communities. You know, 60 years ago, the Bay Area came together and realized so many of these issues cross jurisdictional lines, cities, counties, the Bay, and, you know, formed ABAG. And that was the very beginning. It was one of the first in the country where we came together to address these additional, you know, these really critical issues, whether it's transportation, housing, environment. Those issues are still with us. And I think today, talking about the Bay, we're looking at that same concept of everyone working together. And the expansion of that from the 1960s is we need to work with all aspects of our community, and particularly the community areas of our community that are underserved, that are severely, you know, impacted, whether it's transportation networks, sea level rise, the issues that, you know, Violet and Warner have talked about in terms of history and how do we move forward so everyone can benefit from our planning and our future. And again, we as a region have placed priorities for funding in the communities, underserved, the communities at risk, and the priority equity priority communities. And I think that's a really important initiative. But again, it's not only, it's the regional agencies working together, the cities working together, bringing those entities together, and also the community-based organizations and the community. So ultimately, when you produce a plan that can be implemented, that can be funded, it's a reflection of that broad-based, wide-ranging input. And it's again what we're working on. And it's democracy is sort of an imperfect process. You keep working at it as we move through this process, and it is a challenge with so many jurisdictions and differing points of view. But I think that looking at the history of the Bay Area, we do have that ability to do it. And moving forward, it's really the only way we're going to be successful in implementing projects that improve people's lives, but also to compete for the funds at the state and federal level that we need to do to implement these important projects.
Well, thanks, Amy. At some point, we have to break through and make a decision. And, we heard a lot about risks. Taking risks, sometimes that risk is, how do we make mid-course corrections once we make a decision? Well, how do we work together? And it is, who's responsible for making decisions? And Len, let's hand it over to you, because, it seems like you're firing away there. You're doing a lot of stuff in San Mateo County. So give us your vision for how this could work.
Well, as Amy mentioned, as she was concluding, I think the key is implementation. There's definitely a lot of benefit to thinking as a Bay Area region about what we want this place to look like. But as we drill down and to say, okay, well, how will protection be built? My feeling is that we want it at a scale that's large enough to align multiple communities, so that there aren't communities that are disadvantaged in terms of their protection or the enhancements, trails and whatnot. So we want it on a large enough scale to include multiple players, cross jurisdictions, but we want it small enough that it actually can be built and designed and planned. And you can't plan and design and permit a project that is unwieldy, that is basically driven by committee. And so it has to be small enough so that one agency can actually take it from conceptual planning through the design and permitting process and construction contracting process and build it, and then maintain it, as Allison, you mentioned earlier. And so, it's a sweet spot. It's hard. And I would submit that there's not a Bay Area wide agency that's actually going to do a construction contract and build something on the ground. So you want to find that sweet spot of again, aligning protection, but making sure that it actually can get done. And so, thank you.
That's a great place, I think, for us to conclude. And we've done a good job keeping the time. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks to the Bay Planning Coalition for bringing this group together. And, I think as we've heard, and a lot of the great comments and questions that we've heard from the participants here, there's a lot of work to do, but the more we're able to come together in venues like this and have this conversations and really lay out the challenges and hear the progress that's happening and in places like that we heard today, it's really exciting. So I'm optimistic. I hope everyone's optimistic here that we can solve this. We have the opportunity to bring in resources to help everyone kind of succeed and move forward, including our community-based partners who are so essential to moving these ideas forward. So with that, I'm going to close it out and hand it over to the next session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Allison, and the panelists from the funding section. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So we want people to have an opportunity to stand up. And I really want to we're going to talk about federal issues next after 10 minutes, and then the planning strategies that we're dealing with. Funding, I'm sorry. But I want to give a shout out to all our sponsors who made this possible. Cargill, ESA, Port of Stockton, Briscoe, Ivester, and Basil, Granite Rock, Valley Water, Sonoma Water, RES, Wilshire Consulting, Finmore Wendell, Gelati, Chevron, BIA Bay Area, and SFEI. So We will reconvene at 10:40. Hope to see you at that point again. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody back from the 10-minute break, and we had a great discussion with the Q&A and being moderated by Allison Brooks on planning strategies. We're now going to shift to Eric Saperstein from ENS Resources, and Eric is going to talk to us about the federal update. And we traded emails this morning. He has some very updated information as to what's happening with WRDA. So Eric, the slide is all yours.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. And thanks to BPC for letting me present again. I have a few minutes and I'm going to go over a fair number of issues. Sophie has control, I guess, of my PowerPoint slides. As she's getting that up on the screen, let me tell you a couple of late breaking issues. About 30 minutes ago, the House of Representatives did pass the continuing resolution, which means that the most dangerous place to be in Washington right now is by the exits to the House and Senate chambers as members bolt from Washington to proceed to the airports and trains and what have you to go on recess for the next 6 weeks. What they did in passing the continuing resolution was essentially keep the government open till December 16th. Probably expect that they'll end up extending that till December 23rd and complete, fingers crossed, action on final spending bills. We'll get to that in a second. But what I want to do today is take a look at what we might expect with the lame duck session that will begin on November 14th, 15th, thereabouts. And then I want to close by spending a few seconds on what the Inflation Reduction Act did with respect to direct benefits to ports and related entities that rely on ports. So Sophie, if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, there we go. So midterms, as always, tend to decide the agenda for the lame duck session. This cycle, because of, as you've all seen in the way things are shaking out with respect to what was supposed to be a red tide in both the Senate or maybe a tsunami in the Senate and House for the Republicans, looks like for a variety of reasons could be less of a red tide or tsunami and more of a ripple, particularly in the Senate, where it looks like the Democrats have a better than even chance of holding on to control, either by picking up 1 or 2 seats as opposed to losing 1 or 2 seats. The House sounds like it's going to be more of a circumstance of a smaller majority for the Republicans. We'll just have to see how things shake out in some of the contested seats. The prognosticators in Washington have basically said that it still looks like a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. What does that mean after the midterms? Well, it decides the agenda. It's going to be a binary outcome. And I've sort of broken it up as follows. If it's a lame duck with a broad agenda, it would probably be a function that the Senate remains in Democratic control. The House is a Republican control, albeit a small majority. If in fact the Republicans control both the House and the Senate after the elections, it'll be a limited agenda, probably trying to finalize some must-pass legislation I'll get to in a second, and then reorganizing Congress for the coming new session that begins on January 4th of 2023. So let's assume that we do have an aggressive, very productive lame duck session. Next slide, Sophie. So the priorities, what could they be? Well, appropriations, a Water Resources Development Act, perhaps a public lands bill that would capture drought and other natural resource issues, disaster assistance on the heels of all the fires in California, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona and other places, plus the hurricane this past week, Ian in Florida, and now hitting South Carolina. Have to believe that there'll be some disaster assistance legislation brought up or coupled with the fiscal year 23 appropriations bill. And then, as always, there are the unknowns that we don't know what will either promote activities in a lame duck or maybe upset those activities being concluded in a lame duck. And that could be anything from international conflicts like Ukraine. And it could also be another disaster related to hurricanes or fires, what have you. But let me talk about appropriations real fast. So we got the continuing resolution through. That means we're operating till December 16th at the earliest, maybe going into December 23rd. Appropriations, it looks like the Corps of Engineers, EPA, the Department of the Interior, they all will, based on the House and the Senate marks for the budgets, will all do very well. And this is all on top of the funding that was created in the infrastructure law, as well as funding that was created in the Inflation Reduction Act. So we think at the end of the day, particularly for the Corps of Engineers, the Corps will once again get a very sizable funding level for its operations, maintenance, construction budgets, and as well as environmental infrastructure budget accounts. Water Resources Development Act of 2022. At this stage of the game, late breaking news, yesterday, before the Senate voted on the continuing resolution, an amendment was brought up to be submitted as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. That's the bill that authorizes defense funding. The amendment that was brought up was to attach the Senate passed WRDA bill to the defense bill. And that will be debated in the coming weeks when Congress gets back on November 14th, or the Senate gets back on November 14th. Our guess is, after talking to both House and Senate staff dealing in WRDA, that they have used the defense bill as a vehicle to get WRDA through in the eventuality that there isn't enough legislative time to get it through separately. This is a positive outcome. What it basically tells us that both each chamber, Senate and House, are on their way to finalizing a WRDA bill. And as far as any finalized WRDA bill goes, anticipate once again a restatement and perhaps perhaps on steroids, focus to get the Corps to look more at resilience, to deal with natural systems approaches to flood protection, as well as to redouble its efforts in environmental infrastructure and to deal with beneficial use of dredge materials, as opposed to just continuing the old way of business. We're hopeful, particularly on beneficial use, that in the San Francisco Bay region, that the Corps will be given some significant language, if you will, both in the final WRDA bill and in the appropriations process, to start really doubling down on using beneficial use as a priority objective and consistent with earlier WRDA priorities, that it is a national policy to use beneficial use as a mechanism to deal with resiliency. On Omnibus Public Lands Bill, I just want to emphasize one or two items. This is the bill, you may have heard that Joe Manchin was trying to get permitting reform through on the continuing appropriations bill. That failed, he didn't have enough votes. And so we expect that Manchin will return to the scene of the crime and try to put a permitting reform bill for both fossil energy and alternative energy needs into maybe a public lands bill, or perhaps the appropriations bills that are developed as an omnibus measure during the lame duck. But this public lands bill is really important because it will address a number of issues that are important to natural resource issues and resiliency and drought responses. And so we're optimistic, irrespective of what Manchin does on permitting reform, that there will be some more federal policies and funding directed towards drought responses. And then on disaster assistance, according to the latest reports, they're saying that the Hurricane Ian impacts in Florida could be as high as $45 billion, the most costly disaster in the history. And then finally, we're looking at perhaps separate legislation to deal with fire responses and dealing with rehabilitation, if you will, and the urban wildlife interface challenges created by the fire threats and the nature of climate change impacts. So Sophie, if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so in the few minutes I have left, let me just talk of the Inflation Reduction Act. This was the legislation that essentially, despite its name, it's the climate bill. I want to leave you with one big thought here, which is there is a boatload of money for ports in this act. And I want to point out one of the big pieces of the funding package. There is a program, Port Resilience Grants and Loans, a total of $2.5 billion. That's a lot of money under any scenario, but what's really important to know is that this money has to be spent by fiscal year 2027. We're going into fiscal year 2024 in the coming congressional session. We're in 2023 right now. What that tells you is that's a lot of money that has to be spent. And what this money can be spent for is developing climate action plans, procuring and installing zero emission technologies, and that can be anything from technologies to reduce diesel emissions to EV infrastructure, you name it, at a port. And then finally, to support planning and permitting needs. And again, this is grant money, this is loan money. So it's real money, and the money's there. It doesn't have to be appropriated. That was the That was the big deal of getting the Inflation Reduction Act passed and signed into law. And the question is, who's eligible? This is where it's really a big deal. Ports are eligible. Partnerships among private sector interests and public sector interests are eligible. Local governments are eligible to support technology implementation and installation and procurement. So it is a broad brush of opportunities for anybody who's involved in port-related activities. And then I would also highlight one other thing. If you have a community, what we'll call a fence line community or a disadvantaged community within a port area, there is a $750 million set aside to support improved air quality efforts in those communities to improve the public health. And so that's another bucket of money. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this one other sort of grand thought when it comes to assistance through the Inflation Reduction Act. There are a series of programs out there for heavy vehicle replacement with EV technology and what have you. There are tax credits that can be used to deal with climate change needs. And while ports are public entities, here's the kicker. The law provides for tax credits to be translated into cash subsidies, or that a public entity can use that tax credit and give it to an entity that has a tax liability higher than the tax exempt organization, which is essentially anything. And so you can enter into partnerships with for-profit or public-private partnership opportunities and use your tax credit that you would get, give it to them, and cut some kind of arrangements where the project could go forward at a much more cost-effective basis. But I guess the key for you to take away, if you're a public agency or a port authority or what have you, is these tax credits can be translated into actual cash subsidies. And at the end of the day, we're talking billions of dollars in tax credits for a variety of climate-related activities. So that is where we're at. Sophie, next slide. And I will end there, and I think I'm on time, and I just would like to say, if there's any questions, happy to answer them now, or I can respond in writing to John and his staff later. So thank you very much.
Eric, don't get off yet. Thank you very much, my friend, for the great presentation and good news. So I can ask a sort of political question, since you're in the political environment in DC. Assuming that the House goes Republican and the Senate stays the same, are we going to be able to see achievements in the next legislative years with a Biden presidency and a split House and Senate?
So I think the quick answer to that, John, is it'll be hand-to-hand combat to get anything done. But the biggest thing I would put to you in response to that question is, in the fall of 2023 to the winter of 2023, is that debt limit issue is going to rear its ugly head again. So I think that there will be a huge fight on whether we get into a debt limit increase and how that shakes out, and there'll be efforts to attach things to it to get it through. I think for the most part, based on how much has been done in this congressional year, a lot has been done, a lot of money has been spent. I think that there'll be more of oversight hearings, particularly in the House, on how programs are being operated. And I think there'll be some sort of technical corrections initiated, perhaps on the Build America, Buy America mandates for compliance if you get federal monies. That they may have to tinker with that because of supply chain problems. But overall, I think the next year and a half leading up to the presidential primaries and what have you will probably be more about holding the ground of what's been done today, and then sort of incremental changes where necessary.
Great, thank you, Eric. And again, if anybody has any additional questions, if you send them up to us, we'll get them to Eric. And he talked about funding opportunities. Go to page 13 in your program book. It's a resource book. I call it really more than a program. And that lists a number of the funding opportunities that we have that are available, and there are hyperlinks to those. So Eric, thank you very much. I again, at some point we'll see each other in person again, post-COVID or whatever it's called. And I'm going to move on to our second panel on funding, which Dilip Trivedi from Moffitt Nickel, who's also a BPC board member, is going to take the lead on this. And Dilip, the program is yours.
Thank you. Awesome job with keeping things on track, right on the dot, 10:55. So thank you, John. Well, welcome to our panel 2 participants. We have a great set of speakers. Panel 2 is about funding resiliency. We've got bios are in the program itself, and so I won't introduce them in a whole lot of detail, but I will introduce them by name. We've got Brian Strong, the Chief Resiliency Officer at the City and County of San Francisco. Good to see you again, Brian. It's been a while. He's got an economics background, so I think no one better to run a resiliency program for the city and county. We got Amy Hutzel. Amy, thank you again for your continued support of BPC, attending these events, making time for it. She's the executive officer with the Coastal Conservancy, needs no introduction. And we have Sloan Viola with the Office of Planning and Research. Again, a department at the governor's office, which really has, I would say, led the way in terms of adaptation planning for the state of California. So welcome to all of you. I have 2 remarks, and I hope maybe I'll just take a minute on them, but quite relevant. It's a somber day, of course, in the nation as we grapple with the after effects of Ian. I was looking at some of the videos of roofs flying away from new era houses, not just old houses. 6 foot of surge, 7 foot of surge coming into the living rooms of homes in Fort Myers and some of the other areas. And I look back at the Kentucky floods. I look at the Texas wildfires, the California wildfires. So federal funding is coming when a federal disaster is declared. And engineers will develop new design standards so it will not reoccur. Land use policies will be changed so that we don't develop in some of these high-risk areas. And then the other more local example is land use planning and the role of funding land use planning itself. I couldn't agree with Warner Chabot more when he said that 80% of building resiliency really is in the planning or the land use planning for resiliency itself. A local example is the city of Burlingame, which really took to heart some of the work that was done by One Shoreline and Len, and they incorporated a completely new design standard into their general plan, which is now influencing land use policy. So my remark is that all of this is associated with rebuilding, and that's an important, a smaller subset though of what we are going to have to deal with as a nation. And what about the rest of it? What about the majority of it? Are we focusing on, like our medical healthcare system, where we are focusing on disasters and emergency and ignoring or not having enough funding for primary care? So with that, I'll open it up and welcome Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Dilip. Thank you very much, and nice to meet you all, or see many of you I know as well. So it's good to see you. My name is Brian Strong. As Dilip mentioned, I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City and County of San Francisco. And I also oversee our infrastructure program. And so I've been working with a lot of these issues going back 15 or 16 years. In fact, working with Dilip on some of these issues going back close to 10 years. So I'm also here sort of representing our port. Brad Benson wasn't able to attend. So I do have this one slide that just is a reminder. I think Brad shared this at the last meeting that we had. But it just shows some of the flood risks that we're facing just along our bay shore and really along the eastern bay shore where our port has responsibility. So 40 plus miles of road. I think a lot of you have seen this. The colored hatches there really go back and show the original shoreline that was filled in. But you can also see that sort of lighter reddish level there, which is really sort of our 100-year storm flood map, or I'm sorry, not our 100-year storm flood map, our 100-year sea level rise map that shows areas that are subject to sea level rise. And as a result, we've had a number of policies. We require all of our projects to develop a sea level rise, to complete a sea level rise checklist to make sure that they're thinking about mitigation and adaptation measures across the city. And not shown on this map is a lot of work that's happening on the other side of the city too. Ocean Beach, where we're actually at 95% designed to be doing some work around addressing some of the sand erosion issues right near Sloan Boulevard and the Great Highway. So we can go to the next slide. Great. Just want to let people know, so we are one of the few jurisdictions that do put together a whole 10-year capital plan, and we list what we fund and what we're not going to fund. You can see when we think about the entire city, the federal and state share is really a big part of what we're trying to do. I mean, that addresses a lot of that is going to some of our larger enterprise departments, including our transportation network, but it's critical. So the discussion that Eric was talking about is something we're following very closely. We're excited about the opportunities to take advantage of some of the federal funding that's becoming available. We're also relying a lot on geo bonds and those types of things. We've been very aggressive as a city. We've passed over $10 billion in geo bonds in the past 10, I think I'm close to $10 billion, I think, in the past 15 or 20 years. We did see a geo bond recently that did not pass. I have to say it was the SFMTA, or Major Transportation Bond, for about $400 million. Not a reason to panic. I mean, it failed by 1.5 percentage points, right? You need 67% to pass a geo bond for a city jurisdiction in California. But it does raise, some flags for us that we're going to need to be thinking about how we communicate with the public around these critical issues. And when we're talking about sea level rise and climate change, we're seeing infrastructure costs go up. And some of that's to address greenhouse gas reduction, but some of that's just to address the infrastructure needs that we're going to have to replace or improve, not just our seawall, but all kinds of pumps and other infrastructure, our streets, those types of things is going to be very, very significant. So we're going to need to be tracking this and thinking about new revenue sources as we go forward. Next slide. I think this is the last slide. I just wanted to mention a little bit. This is a little different from what Eric was talking about. One of the things we've been trying to do, and Brad may have mentioned it before, is push FEMA and some of the other federal agencies, Army Corps of Engineers, and those around the benefit cost analysis work that they're doing. This work has tended to actually not promote equity, but sort of have the opposite impact. It tends to favor jurisdictions with significant resources. It also tends to favor different types of hazardous events. For instance, hurricanes, though certainly understandable that Florida is going to need a lot of resources, but hurricanes, for instance, do considerably better than earthquakes in a lot of these formulas, because hurricanes happen more regularly. Earthquakes don't happen as regularly, but when they do happen, they are very significant. The other big piece of this is the 7% discount rate that the Office of Management Budget's been carrying for years. We really think that this is an opportunity to change that. There's a report that's going to be coming out by RAND that's going to be critical of the 7% discount rate. And what that does is it really discounts our future projects. It means that the projects that have big benefits down the road are much harder to get through the cost analysis, and they tend to fall off. So that is going to be a big effort that's going on. And we want to encourage other jurisdictions that are interested in this to reach out to me or Brad to get involved. So those are the slides I wanted to mention. I'm really excited to talk more and to hear more questions from people and have a discussion. So thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you so
back to you, Dilip. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate the remarks. Yes, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions on this. The next speaker is Amy. I'm sorry, Mark. Mark, please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm call it a registered municipal advisor. We work with cities and special districts and other public agencies around the state and financing major projects. I've been doing this work for over 40 years. In the last 7 years, been working in the climate space, and it's been the best part of my entire career. It's very daunting, but it's a whole lot of fun. I'm going to start with wrong numbers. I've been doing the best wrong numbers I can on cost and looking at the challenges and looking at sea level rise. I won't take you through this chart in depth. I love talking about it. Basically, I wanted to get some shape on the cost per linear mile for horizontal levees in the Bay Area. And the bottom line, I'll just cut right to the chase. I think it's the lowest in numbers, 125 million per linear mile. That obviously varies on a whole bunch of issues. When you start looking at projects that have been CEQA'd, NEPA'd, Army Corps permits, everything fully bid, and the logistics of material sourcing and movement have been worked into it, the cost is really staggeringly high. And well, the other things we'll talk about is how many linear miles of bayfront do we really have to protect? That is a key question, and there's a huge range on that. I'll get to that in another slide. The bottom line, what's it going to cost if all this was local share? I know that's not going to happen. We're going to get grant money. And it was done basically as a parcel tax, 2 million taxable parcels in the Bay Area. You look at the bold-faced numbers on the second row from the bottom, it ranges from $1,000 per parcel to $8,000 a parcel. So let's be optimistic and assume it's a mere $1,000 a parcel per year on a bond. That's per year on a 30-year bond issue. That's what I do for a living. $1,000 per household per year in the Bay Area is simply, under what we know now, is non-doable. Sophie, next slide, please. This is one of my favorite slides. I'm going to embarrass Amy, because Measure AA is just a real game changer and a saver for the Bay Area in so many ways. But the message of the slide is that, as wonderful as it is, it's not scalable for where we need to go. Measure AA was $12 per parcel per year. I just put on the table, for the sake of discussion, that we need to go to $500 per parcel per year, assuming 50% grant funding. Okay, that's a 40 times increase. So let's take Measure A. Apologize, Amy, for putting your great program in a different spotlight. Facebook, with all that beautiful real estate development at the foot of the Dumbarton Bridge in major sea level rise vulnerability, pays about $500 a year in Measure AA. West Oakland pays $500,000 a year. This is not social equity. This is the opposite. This is regressive. Next slide, please. So another 800 pounds gorilla at the Thanksgiving table that we don't like to talk about, but John's organization, the Bay Planning Coalition, is in the middle of, is dredging and finding and sourcing and transporting the material we need to build all this. One of our climate adaptation projects we have the privilege to be working on is the North Richmond Living Levee, funded by Amy's organization. Thank you again. ESA as our engineers, thank you for being a sponsor here. I asked them to come up with a range of material per linear mile required for different options. And depending on the design criteria for your horizontal levee, it ranges from 40,000 cubic yards per linear mile, that's our low end number, up to 127,000 cubic yards. One of the things that drives that is this notion of making horizontal levees, quote, additive. Additive means, I think Lynn Manderman went to this, okay, are you going to use the Ocean Protection Council's 3.5 feet? Are you going to use the Coastal Commission's 10 feet? Well, gee, what if you compromise and say, we'll do 3 feet, but we'll lay in a base to make it additive up to 10 feet. So you have to totally rebuild the whole levee. Well, additive sounds great, but you look at like it takes you from 40,000 cubic yards to 120,000 cubic yards per linear mile. Then the other question that comes up is, how many linear miles of bayfront do we have? The numbers that people who are way smarter than I am came up with is somewhere between 600 and 1200. For the record, if you plug into Google Maps a drive around the bay, it's 180 miles. So there are major questions here. You can look at this. I plugged in cubic yards per linear mile, by the number of linear miles. It's a six-fold variation. Is it 24 million cubic yards or 150 million cubic yards? Those questions really need to be addressed. And this whole question of dredging and sourcing material and transporting it, we need to deal with now. This is a major cost driver. I know Valley Water is a sponsor. Their Oliso project, a horizontal levee, was really impacted by those questions. Next slide, please. A graph showing sales tax ain't progressive, it ain't neutral, it is seriously regressive. This is a chart showing the percentage of your personal income paid towards sales tax by your income level. The lowest 20% pay 7%. Sales tax has been a major funding source for transportation and other projects in the Bay Area. In my opinion, it is not scalable for where we have to go now. Next slide, please. Gas tax, same drill, only it's worse. A huge funder for transportation, lowest 20%, 15% of personal income. If these numbers are right, the best numbers my staff could come up with, of 20% low income people goes to pay gas tax. Let's get really dangerous here. Let's add the 7% for sales tax to the 15% for gas tax. Team, that's 22% of disposable income, according to these numbers, going to pay sales and gas tax for poor people in California. That's a non-starter. Next slide, please. This is Allison's favorite slide. We've had a debate on this. I won't give you the backstory, but here we have the yellow vests. That was over a gas tax, a diesel tax in France. And guess what happened? People got really upset. So I am the advocate that social equity is a design criteria, because in California, as was just noted, we have to get a 2/3 vote. Bill from San Francisco noted that on GO bonds. It's a property tax based levy ad valorem, which is also not, I'll call it very socially equitable. I'd call it more random. And if you're going to get a 2/3 vote, you're going to have to deal with the social equity issues at this scale. You aren't going to get a $500 per year parcel tax approved on a 2/3 vote anywhere, I believe, in the state of California right now. And if you scale this up at $500 a parcel tax to just kind of make it slap you in the face with the obvious, using my Facebook West Oakland comparison, Facebook is paying $20,000 a year, and West Oakland has an exaction of $20 million per year. No way. If you're an exact $20 million a year out of West Oakland, you're not going to spend it on Sea Level Rise. There's a lot of other things, as we all know on this call, you could spend it on. So bottom line, social equity is a design criteria. Next slide, please. Good news, Eric just took us through this. $373 billion in the IRA, FEMA, BRIC, EPA, NOAA, ACOE, Army Corps of Engineers, all have all kinds of money coming at them. Capacity building by name is now in grant programs at the federal level. That is huge. State governor's got $54 billion. Coastal Conservancy's got money, OPR, DWR, CAL FIRE. It's spread around Sacramento. And again, there is now express authorization to fund capacity building in state grant programs. That is great news. Apologize for was something got lost in translation on the slides here, but one caveat, many of these grant programs are brand new. The responsible grant making public entities are developing the programs now. They're not ready to roll them out. Next slide, please. Last slide, grant funding and social equity. Grant funding is the best tool, in my opinion, we have right now for addressing social equity in funding resilience. We can't do it through our sales, gas tax, ad valorem, or parcel tax levies we have authorization for. It's a non-starter, it's not there. What we can do, we also can't do it under Prop 218. Cost of service is the only way you can levy utility rates in the public sector. But we can, what Measure W and LA County did, really positive. They prioritized grant funding for socially vulnerable communities and the way they allocate the money. Great, you can do it that way. FEMA BRIC, for example, uses the Center for Disease Control Social Vulnerability Index map. Check that out if you haven't already. It's an amazing map for the whole country. And your applications, they want to know where you are in that map. And again, as we all know, state grants give priority to disadvantaged communities in their scoring matrix. That's the end of my presentation. So back to the next speaker, and thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your comments and observations there. Looking at the bright side, hopefully Measure AA was just the tip of the spear. We showed that we could do it, and we need to change it. Our next speaker, Amy Hudsell. Good morning, welcome.
Great, thank you. And I think the slides have all turned kind of black and white, so it's going to be a little boring. But thanks for having me again at the BPC Summit, and this has been a great conversation. I'm going to talk mostly about coastal conservancy funding. And we are in the midst of updating our 5-year strategic plan. I hate to do this to anybody, but comments are due October 1st. So if you want to work on it tonight, you can do so. We did, I think Sophie sent out an email about it. And we'll be taking the final plan to our board for adoption in December. It's a 5-year plan, really focused on equity and climate adaptation. And the goals within the plan, the first goal is prioritizing equity. We are committing 40% of our funding to systemically excluded communities, which is defined in the strategic plan. Under our last strategic plan, it was a 35% goal for disadvantaged communities, and we have met that goal each year. Other goals under equity include projects with tribes, returning power to tribes, and incorporation of workforce development in our projects. Goal 2, enjoy the coast, is really about our public access projects and programs, and making sure the coast, which by the word coast, that includes the Bay Area, making sure the coast is accessible to everyone. So our Explore the Coast grants, our Coastal Stories program, which we have just kicked off with our first set of grants, building regional trails, piers and waterfronts, lower cost overnight accommodations on the coast, and other recreational projects and programs. Goal 3, protect and restore the coast, really focused on protecting land, conserving land under the state's 30 by 30 program, and restoring or enhancing habitats, particularly wetland habitats, riparian habitats. Also continuing to support working lands, ranch land, farmland, timberland, and cutting green tape, which is my favorite initiative of Secretary Crowfoot. And I noticed, I think in the Q&A, Pat Mappelli brought up the challenges of permitting projects. There's some really good Ezra Klein podcasts on this topic, and it applies to restoration and flood management as well. We have set up a Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team in San Francisco Bay to make the permitting of wetlands projects. more efficient. I think we still have a long ways to go in the San Francisco Bay, in California, in terms of the layers of laws and regulations and the multiple agencies that enforce those laws and regulations, and just how long it can take to move a project through that process. Goal 4, climate ready. So our sea level rise adaptation projects, wildfire resilience projects, and really looking at multi-benefit climate adaptation projects. And finally, organizational goals. So, supporting our staff who are living in the Bay Area and Southern California on state salaries. So I want to thank them for sticking with us, and continued transparency about our work. Next slide. So we are really enthusiastic about the funding that's come through for the Coastal Conservancy in this year's state budget. I think there were 4 different budget bills, so it's a little hard to piece it together. But for the Conservancy, it's approximately $700 million this fiscal year. Half of that is for coastal resilience, or it's also called climate resilience in one of the bills, kind of broadly, and that includes public access and regional trails. So we're talking, very, very broad definition of coastal resilience. And then quite a bit of funding for sea level rise resilience, some of it designated for San Francisco Bay, funding to support acquisitions that advance nature-based solutions. There's 37.5 to protect communities from sea level rise, and ports and waterfronts are specifically mentioned in that. Funding specifically for San Francisco Bay wetlands, for wildfire resilience. And then there were also some specific legislative priorities in our funding, including, Point Mulade, which we're very hopeful about. So there's a lot of funding, and the Conservancy is moving forward with our programs. Mark had mentioned agencies are setting up their programs, but most of our funding is under existing programs, and we are moving this funding forward. We are planning to send out an email in early November explaining how to reach out to us for funding, but the information is on our website. You can contact us. There's a pre-application process. So this funding is in hand, and we are moving it out the door expeditiously to good projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Appreciate your comments and all the information here. Next speaker is Sloan. Sloan, welcome. This is, I think, your first time here. We did have your colleagues last time, and it was very exciting to hear about all the new funding mechanisms and the focus on community building. And so I'll let you take it away. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Yes, thank you. Glad to be here. And yes, I'm sorry the difference in continuity from having our former deputy director, Nuantara Key here. My name is Sloan Viola, and I am a council program manager. So I oversee the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Programs Technical Advisory Council and related coordination activities. Next slide, please. So our program is responsible for the coordination and alignment of the state's adaptation and resiliency efforts across state agencies, and then also with local, regional, and tribal governments. We conduct this coordination in several ways, but for today's discussion about resilience funding opportunities and support, I'm going to focus on these final areas of support. And if you click to the next slide, I think I have an animation that'll bold those areas. Yep. Thank you so much. And so today's discussion will focus on these programmatic areas, but if you would like to learn more about our program in general, you can check out these links to our website. And then we also have a link for a comprehensive overview of our program through our impact report. Next slide, please. And so first, I'm going to start with our new and exciting investment programs. Next slide, please. So the Adaptation Planning Grant Program is a $25 million program to support local, regional, and tribal resiliency planning efforts. These grants will help these entities identify resilience priorities and develop a pipeline of resiliency projects. We're really excited to announce that the draft guidelines for this program were just released this week, and public comment will be open until October 28th. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Planning Grant Program seeks to support equitable outcomes by building community capacity and planning for integrated infrastructure planning that helps the community respond to multiple climate risks. ICARP staff will provide technical assistance in the application development, project development, implementation, and evaluation of projects. Unfortunately, third-party technical assistance is not currently available for applicants to the grant program, but in subsequent rounds, ICARP intends to allocate additional funding to provide third-party technical assistance providers that will be able to assist with application development, implementation, and evaluation. And then finally, to support the development of competitive proposals, ICARP will hold one technical assistance application webinar to review the guidelines and answer questions from potential applicants. And ICARP staff will also host 2 targeted application workshops, one for rural and one for tribal communities. Next slide, please. The Regional Resilience Grant Program is a $250 million program that supports regional scale planning by local governments and tribes. These grants will support capacity building, planning, and implementation efforts. In the first round, this program will distribute $25 million, half of which is set aside for regional adaptation action plans. This program conducted a series of stakeholder engagement workshops through the summer, and the summary of that feedback is available online. And this information is being incorporated into the development of our draft guidelines, which will be released later this year. Next slide, please. This program seeks to support regional scale collaboration to address the highest priority climate risks of a region, especially those posed to vulnerable communities. This program will support capacity building by funding sustainable staffing and multi-scale regional collaboration, prioritizing vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. The program will also build capacity by providing technical assistance during the application and reporting processes. Next slide, please. Our final grant program through ICARP is the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program, a $125 million program that will build capacity for local, regional, and tribal governments to address their extreme heat risk. The program will also support implementation of California's Extreme Heat Action Plan, released earlier this year. This program is in its early stages, so stay tuned for listening sessions and guideline development in early 2023. Next slide, please. Because capacity building is so important, I thought I'd zoom out really quickly to highlight a capacity building program at our sister agency, the California Strategic Growth Council. The Community Assistance for Climate Equity Program, or CASE, coordinates technical assistance for communities seeking funding through California climate investment programs. The program also provides grants for capacity building activities through the Regional Climate Collaboratives, or RCC program. Applications for round 1 of RCC grants closes soon, so highly encourage you to apply if bandwidth and time allows. This program provides technical assistance during a pre-application phase. So in round 2, getting in early will also enable access to these to this assistance and resource. Whereas currently the timeline's pretty close to the end. Next slide, please. So next I'll cover the resources and other support we provide and some that are available elsewhere to help entities access state funding. Next slide, please. So our climate services team provides supports adaptation practitioners in accessing, understanding, and applying the best available climate science to adaptation planning and projects. A key resource to support this work is the Adaptation Clearinghouse, a searchable database of over 900 adaptation resources, including data, tools, case studies, and best practices. The Clearinghouse also integrates with the Adaptation Planning Guide to create an interactive web-based version of this guidance. And we also have a dedicated topic page on investing in adaptation, which aggregates all of the Clearinghouse's resources related to adaptation funding and is a really helpful starting point for resources and recommendations. Next slide, please. One resource available through the Investing in Adaptation page is a Gantt chart that maps out timelines for several adaptation funding programs through the fiscal year. The goal of this resource was to support practitioners in their strategic planning efforts to sequence grants and project timelines to maximize their access to state funding opportunities. A few caveats to this is that it's a static resource, so some information may have changed since this was first published in July of this year. So this is not also this isn't a truly comprehensive resource that covers every possible resilience funding opportunity. So there are some programs that exist, provided by the state that aren't captured here. Next slide, please. Zooming out again, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research provides support for funding outside of ICARP through its work related to federal grants. Our federal grants webpage includes information on how to apply for federal grants, federal funding opportunities, and also information on awarded federal grants. Next slide, please. Stepping back even further, the California State Library maintains the state grants portal, which posts information on upcoming or open state funding opportunities. The user-friendly search functions of the portal allow users to search for opportunities by topic, eligibility, or timeline. And additionally, recent legislation requires agencies to send information to the portal on awarded grants, so there will be additional data available soon. Next slide, please. All right, and thanks so much for your time today. Looking forward to the discussion that follows these presentations. And just a flag, if you'd like to sign up for updates or reach out with any specific or general questions, links and contact info are available here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sloan. Really appreciate those comments. Q&A. Well, I'll ask the panel first if they had any questions for each other, any comments on the other panelists itself. I'll start out with that. Give you the first opportunity there. If not, then I'll, so I had, Mark, and this is mainly to you, I saw the tables. I think that is, it's an eye opener when you start looking at, parcel taxes and is it equitable? Are there other, are we ready to maybe go to the next level with a different kind of benefit cost analysis? Is it the number of parcels that benefit from it? Is it the number of people, the number of citizens that benefit, kind of like the GDP model that we use, that using that, or a sales tax, different approaches to it. I think that is going to be a key element in any kind of new financing. Is going to be the benefit cost and equitable remuneration from all the beneficiaries.
No, thank you. It's a great question. In California, we have to get a 2/3 vote on pretty much anything. You can do assessments, which is a very limited application on a more or less a simple majority. In my view, what we need to do, number one, is we have a 55% yes vote on school general obligation bonds. And I think I'm the fan of size. On November 24 ballot, we have a measure for climate change and related hot button items to allow a 55% yes vote on geo bonds. Geo bonds are not really socially equitable, but they aren't as bad as sales tax or gas tax. It's a significant improvement. I see Brian's nodding his head. Yeah, no surprise, 55% in San Francisco would be a lifesaver for you folks. The other thing where I ultimately think this has to go is that regional and local government needs to have access to the income tax. Even if it's just a pure flat income tax, forget progressive, everybody paid. If you do the math, you take the income levels in the Bay Area, we paid 0.5% to dealing with climate change mitigation, adaptation, the whole ball of wax. That puts a lot of money on the table. I think our bottom line is saying our existing revenue raising measures that are authorized by the state statutes for local and regional government are in the long run fully scaled non-starters. We're not going to get there.
Yeah, Dilip, I just wanted to chime in on that. The Restoration Authority parcel tax as well. I certainly understand what Mark is pointing out about a parcel tax. The Restoration Authority, it is a $12 per year parcel tax in the 9-county Bay Area. So it's $1 a month for anyone who owns a piece of property, a parcel, which the board members spent quite a bit of time discussing the equity issues and deciding on the dollar amount. But it's probably the lowest cost thing on anyone's parcel tax bill that they get annually. And we have done quite a bit of work to ensure equitable distribution of the Restoration Authority funds, including setting up a community grants program separate from the standard Measure AA grants program. So, you know, like with the West Oakland example, we have provided a grant to the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project to do community engagement in West Oakland. We have not given a grant to Facebook. So there's, you know, I understand the equity issues, but we also have to work with what we actually have that exists. Would love to do an income tax. That, you know, that's not an option. There's many things that would be more equitable that are not options for government agencies. So I think, yeah, Measure AA was a good example of what we could do in the Bay Area, and obviously a lot more is needed. And it's really great to see all the state and federal funding that we can tap into as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's some, you know, good comments there. I'm looking at the Q&A also. There's a question for Sloan. You know, are there resources for folks? Maybe I guess what their meaning is, are there training modules or things like that for applying for grants? And then what is the time frame for the adaptation planning grant program? When can project work start?
Thanks for that question. So the resources we host on the clearinghouse all link to third-party entities. So I am not too intimately familiar with it as if we had developed it ourselves. So I'll have to circle back and see if there are anyone specifically related to trainings to access grants. On the note about the timeline for the adaptation planning grants program, we're in the draft guideline phase right now. Final comments are due at the end of October. So we hope to have the final guidelines and requests for proposals going out later this fall. And then there will be a application review period. So awards should be made sometime early next year.
Okay, all right, great. And those links, just for everyone's knowledge, I think Sophie has posted all of those links on the BPC website itself. So please do, we encourage you to look there, look at the links there, the documents that Amy has provided. The slides will be available as well, so it'll all be there. Another question, and this is not from anyone, it's probably more from me, and I think it probably applies both to Brian and to you, Mark, is redevelopment was taken away with a certain objective in mind by the governor at that point. Is that hurting us right now? Is there a reason now using climate, as a reason to restart that program itself? Or are we stuck with, identifying creative ways with IFDs and muni bonds and geo bonds, which are all water approved?
I'm looking at Brian. You start.
I was hoping you were going to take that one first, Mark. Yeah, I would say it's hurting. I mean, the flexibility that you had with redevelopment that's sort of gone, and now we're sort of jumping through hoops to do IFDs or IRFDs or some of these other tools. Yeah. We're using a lot more community facility districts. They're complicated, they're challenging to do. You still require a fair amount of voter support and so forth. And also, even in San Francisco, which, we're kind of blessed by being a city and a county. So supposedly we have one governance structure. But even under that one governance structure, we still have a really tough time agreeing and identifying jurisdiction. And so many of these issues are cross-jurisdictional and, or cross various departmental boundaries and so forth. So that authority was important. We are thinking about trying to set up some joint powers authorities in San Francisco in some of our more challenged areas, like around Isleas Creek, where where it's financing, but it's also land use, right? You also need to start to make adjustments to land use to think about how you can. So traditionally, finance is on one side, right? And land use is another side. And the finance and the planning people don't always talk to each other very much. So it's kind of like, how do you pull those together? And we need to be thinking about both aspects.
And I like to add to what Brian said, going back to what Allison said earlier about private development, multiple benefits, housing. The thing that I miss in redevelopment, and I did redevelopment bonds for 30 years. I mean, I lived off that industry, paid for my house here in Mill Valley, all that. So I'm a big fan. But is public-private partnership. The redevelopment law in 1948 was a constitutional amendment that allowed local government to partner with the private sector, with developers, without it being considered a, quote, gift of public funds. When we lost redevelopment, we no longer have the ability in local government to partner with the private sector the way we could under the redevelopment law. And that's a real problem. Leaving out tax increment and revenue, if you're really going to start doing public-private partnerships to, for example, get housing development, to come in and pay for a part of what it takes to adapt the bay, we need that ability to do public-private partnerships with, developers. We don't have that legal authority now. It's a real problem. The other thing I want to add is the area of managed retreat. This is not a Steel of a Rise project, but when the municipal advisor for the town of Paradise, we're going to try to put together a wildfire buffer zone, which is a big swath of open space on the east side of town to keep it from getting burned the way it did before. That's got managed retreat written all over it. You have to go out and acquire a lot of land. And you'll have people who are not going to cooperate for whatever reason, the best intentions. You're going to have to go to eminent domain. You're going to have to get people who are living in their, RVs or literally camping out on their former home site off of the property. And this managed retreat goes into the world of eminent domain, which is a huge power of redevelopment. And so the things that we all stop talking, we need two things. We need public-private partnership power, and we need eminent domain power from redevelopment.
Yeah, and just a little bit of a side note on that is that, we have in government, we kind of have a few ways that we can move things, right? And one way is by raising money and taking care of projects and doing critical projects that we talked about. We can also, then you have the regulatory side where we can establish mandates to encourage people to do things. And then we can kind of lead by example, I would say. And the other one is sort of encourage good behavior. I noticed that, in Canada, they're actually recently put out a report looking at the cost of climate change. And they're really talking about how we can start to, mandate or ask the private sector to start incorporating climate change into their decision making as well. And this may go into information, reports, requirements. It's interesting. Mark knows this, when we're issuing bonds now, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, they're asking us about climate change more and more. I still haven't seen it completely worked into their formulas for how you get a rating, but they're asking those questions. We're about to, after this, I'm meeting with an investment group that are asking about climate change. Someone that buys PIMCO, they buy a lot of municipal bonds and those things. So how can we begin to, I think, also encourage that private sector, which owns 85% of our infrastructure, right? So how do we get them more engaged as well?
Great. Yeah, I know those are definitely challenges. Talking about managed retreat, I will come back to perhaps one comment that Professor Christina Hill, I don't know if she's still on here. It was about managed retreat, and the comment was, it was more a comment than a question, is like the Dutch, can we not learn to adapt in place rather than managed retreat always means giving up and going away either by eminent domain or things like that. But are there ways that you can adaptively stay in place and still it is called retreating from the disaster or the effects of the flooding rather than retreating the parcel itself? So it was just a comment. I don't know if any one of you would want to chime in on that. The Dutch, of course, they don't have, something as stringent as the Clean Water Act or the Rivers and Harbors Act or, Section 7 consultation or the ESA. So that was that. Another comment, again, and this is something I think, Amy, you mentioned. So the BRIT has been a great example of a certain kind of projects and facilitating permits. DMMO was another very successful, model where dredging can be, accomplished. What can we do as a Bay Area to start taking a look at flood management, flood control? Some may be gray, some may not be, it won't be green. Is there a way that agencies, what can we as a coalition do to facilitate that? What can our representatives here do and take the message up to Sacramento if that's what is needed?
Yeah, I think one of the questions was about kind of the expansion of the BRIT, and that is, that's in BCDC's Bay Adapt plan to, expand the BRIT beyond restoration projects. I think that's, it's totally doable. It just takes funding to support staff at the state and federal regulatory agencies, to be focused on your projects. I mean, this is what Caltrans did with the seismic retrofit of the bridges in the Bay Area. They funded the regulatory agencies to be at the table and, basically dedicated to their projects. So, it's not a new model. I think with the BRIT, we did go a couple steps beyond, just the dedicated staff in terms of identifying sand in the gears or policy issues that the managers at the BRIT agencies could address. I think that's been kind of the harder challenge. There are really a few different ways to go about this cutting green tape work. One is through programmatic permits, which is happening quite a bit for restoration projects. The Fish and Wildlife Service just released the programmatic biological opinion for restoration in California. Water Board did a general order for restoration. So Sustainable Conservation, a nonprofit, is doing quite a bit of the work around these programmatics. There's legislative or, addressing kind of the regulations themselves. Right now, there's a CEQA exemption, a statutory exemption for restoration projects that Department of Fish and Wildlife manages. It has an end date. It's a pilot, really, project. So, looking at ways to simplify CEQA or the actual, regulations, laws that apply to projects. And then there's the coordination element, which is, I think, what the BRIT is exemplifying. But I think you have to address all three parts of this, and it's not simple. I mean, we've got decades and decades and decades of layers of laws and regulations, meant to protect the environment, and now we're dealing with climate change, where the status quo might be the worst option versus actually implementing projects.
I'd like to add something to that on BRIT, working with the North Richmond Living Levee, our 5-mile stretch of North Richmond. We went to BRIT, and the bottom line, great dialogue, great people, but there's something missing that's not their fault, but we need to deal with it, and that's called design criteria. And the worst fear of a developer is designing the wrong project. You didn't know what the design criteria were, and you designed the wrong project. We got that problem in North Richmond. Do we use the Ocean Protection Council's 3.5 feet? Do we use the Coastal Commission's 10 feet? Do we use some other number in between? Do we design for 3.5 feet, but make it additive to 10 feet, which triples the amount of material we need? Then we have the West County wastewater districts, very important wastewater treatment plants sitting there. Do we design that to a higher level of protection than we do for the disadvantaged community of North Richmond and Parchester? Okay, all these questions are on the table, and I'm going to sound like a whining developer because these all affect costs, and I'm supposed to figure out how to pay for all this. They all affect costs dramatically. There's no guidance right now. And there's some good reasons for that, because we're just getting it together right now. But I really want to encourage people, besides figuring out how to deal with sourcing material and moving it around. Amy, all the regulators on the call, man, we need some design criteria. We should not be having, if you really want me trying to make recommendations on the wastewater treatment plant versus North Richmond, 3.5 feet versus 10 feet, that's, we aren't the people who should be deciding that. So that's my editorial.
I'll probably speak for Amy and say she's not a regulator.
That's true. I'm picking on Amy, sorry.
If anything, I think her efforts or the Conservancy's efforts have helped the most with changing certain, constraints that we have in the regulatory community itself. There aren't a whole lot of other questions. So I was watching a piece on, I think it was on Channel 5, it was about Highway 37. Right, and was all the effort that's going into Highway 37, and folks talking about, well, should we just continue working and not doing any improvements because we don't have the funds for the 100-year, relocation up to 2,100 and 6 feet of sea level rise, or should we also continue doing something in the interim for maybe the 30-year lifetime and start planning for alternate routes, which will become the 2,100. And then same on the radio the other day, I think it was Congressman John Garamendi and one of the, not the reporters, but a caller, just asked him the same question and said, there are folks around the world who have done creative pontoon bridges and, other creative aspects to continue having transportation in place rather than a $2 billion relocation. Again, it's not a question for anyone, but I'd just like to, put it out there. When you talked about design criteria, that's, one of the things. Should we just continue waiting till we accumulate, our piggy bank grows so that we can deal with the 50-year from now flood, or should we start looking at wildfires and nuisance flooding that is happening every king tide?
Yeah, at Highway 37, I guess I just want to put a pitch in for the longer term project. We've been working very closely with Caltrans and MTC and the county transportation agencies. I think there's 4 of them along Highway 37. And as part of this Bayland Steering Committee. And there's just a great opportunity at Highway 37. I mean, we did this in Resilient by Design with Highway 37. There's a great opportunity to incorporate, a transportation solution, mostly, a causeway with a significant amount of wetlands restoration and, incorporate multimodal transportation and recreation elements. So it's expensive, but I think we should be heading towards that longer term solution in that particular instance sooner rather than later. I think Congressman Huffman has really, been clear about his concerns with the interim project, which is not addressing sea level rise. It's addressing the horrible traffic that people sit in, and I do feel for them. But if you bring in, that amount of sediment needed to create that berm, it's like a $500 million cost estimate at this point, which is going to go up. And then the idea would be to take it out to build the causeway. It does not make a lot of sense to some people. I understand that there's, horrible traffic that people are sitting in, and the transportation agencies want to be responsive to that. I just think we could have a, really excellent multi-benefit self-mitigating project. And we should be working towards that sooner rather than later.
A comment here, a question really, and this is from Kathy. Kathy, glad to know you're also on here. None of the conversations seem to talk about operations and maintenance. Does anyone have any thoughts about addressing O&M needs?
Yeah, I mean, I could throw in some thoughts. Obviously, we're not very good at it typically, just to state the obvious, but we, when we're talking about the benefit cost analysis to fund these projects, O&M often is not included, or not included into the extent that it should be. We tend to fudge the numbers on the useful life of a project. I mean, often for our buildings, we say 40 or 50 years. I can tell you in San Francisco, usually after 40 or 50 years, the building becomes historic. So we can expect it to be around for another 40 or 50 years. So we need to be incorporating it. And what we've tried to do is incorporate the O&M into our infrastructure planning, right, into our 10-year capital plan. And we have a separate sort of financial plan that looks at those costs. To me, if we're not going to address the O&M, then we end up sort of being back in the same place where we are. And right now, I feel like we're behind the 8 ball even more than we have been before, because a lot of our jurisdictions have not done a good job maintaining their infrastructure, which then when you add climate change on top of it, it makes it even more difficult, right? So it compounds the impact of climate change. So developing, I think, more realistic measures, and also I think a more realistic way to address the costs. I mean, a lot of what we're doing in government, we're sort of subsidizing the costs, right? The biggest examples, I think, around water and some of those things. So we need to I think we need to be much more honest about what those costs are and start working them into the formulas, that we're doing. So
I want to second what Brian said, and the way one of the reasons things don't get maintained is that the O&M cost was never really factored in. It gets buried in the general fund of the public agency, where it's competing with police, fire, the unhoused, go down the list. And where you see things better maintained, there's a special tax of some kind, a parcel tax, an assessment, like the levees along the Sacramento River, for example, in the middle of that. And that's typically maintained by special property assessments of one kind or another. So they get maintained. But that becomes part of the overall, again, potentially gigantic exaction burden on Bay Area residents. After we get through paying for the huge capital costs, even after grants, we have to maintain it. And if we really want to maintain it well, we're going to be doing some kind of special exaction to fund that.
All right. Since it is a funding, did anyone have any? I'm sorry. No. Since it is a funding panel, I will, maybe throw out a provocative, thought right here, and that is the role of mitigation banking, right? I mean, I know it's not been very welcome here in the Bay Area, but a different version of mitigation banking, where we can have our low-lying dike baylands up in the North Bay, restored, where we can have a home for beneficial reuse, which is financially, possible to do. Is there a role for something like a creative offset mitigations that help with beneficial reuse, restoration, and flood management? I'll just throw it out there.
I'll give a quick answer. Going back to what Allison said about building new housing, even looking at North Richmond, depending how we design that, they're creating opportunities for new housing areas. And on the same time, but to do that, you have to have a mitigation bank. You're burning some wetlands or what could be wetlands to build a new housing. And the best way to do that is through a mitigation bank. So I think if we're going to harness the power of home developers to pay for what we need to adapt the Bay, I think mitigation banking is going to become important.
Tim. All right, well, I mean, at this time, maybe I'll ask some of the previous panelists if they had any comments, if you want to just, open your video up. We do have about, I guess, about 10 minutes or so, right, Sophie? If there's anyone who does have a question for the panelists, please.
We have about 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, all right. Any observations, anything that folks would like to see? I know there was one thing that we are hoping to get into the next panel, and that would be the role of insurance, both FEMA as well as private insurance in climate resiliency planning. So climate planning and resiliency funding, the role of insurance for that. So anyway, that's, I see a hand raised there. Please go ahead, Violet.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. And very appreciate the information that was provided regarding funding. My question, more like a comment or concern, is around, again, funding. We hear there's a lot of money coming, to address climate change and adaptation. There's quite a lot of priorities around, allocating those fundings to communities, the most vulnerable communities. However, as one of the issues that we still face is how can we access those funding, right? That's one of the capacity needs that us as CPOs, deal with. Like, a lot of the time there's funding available, but when we try to apply for it, it's just, out of our reach. It's even the criteria, we talk about disadvantaged communities, and that's also a disadvantage to us right now, because we look at Cal Enviro screen as a criteria. You have to be eligible, but vulnerabilities is more than those data indicates, right? Which is why a lot of the communities voices that I hear is that you have to go in the community and identify those vulnerabilities. So it's not just identifying using models where the Cal Enviro screen does, but there's also other factors that does influence, or that makes us more vulnerable. However, because of those criteria in place, we cannot access those funding. So it's very hard for us because of our capacity. And even if funding for capacity building is available, it's very limited. So all these issues that we are dealing with, trying to access those funding. And again, like I'm saying, like, there's a lot of money coming. But where is it going to land? Where can we have a piece of that? And I like to also take this moment just to thank Coastal Conservancy, who is here also on the panel, because working with them, that helped us get those funding for our rain gardens and water cistern system, as well as our coastal restoration project. They actually made it easier for us to access those funding. So I think also one experience that I like to share is that just working with the team there, and also the flexibility. And I think one of the criteria that really made our project, possible was because of our community engagement process. And that was a positive, according to Coastal Conservancy's criteria for project funding. So I just want to share that, and thank you all for the information and knowledge share.
Thank you so much, Violet. I'll turn it over to John, but in parting, there was a comment from Colonel Arnett, Kevin Arnett, and he was thanking the organizers, but I see the thing I wanted to bring out is the Army Corps is definitely looking for ways that they can partner, add value, and contribute. And if you look at, what other regions have had to do, New York, Gulf, Everglades, is the Army Corps who's contributed, quite a bit of effort. So, John?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dilip. I don't know if my screen is frozen or not. I guess it's not now, it was. So we had a great 2 panels today talking about planning and funding, and as well as a federal update, which I need to thank everybody, and we will, before I hand this over to Laura Kennedy, who's the president of BPC. We have a lot of challenges, they're daunting, but I must say, if the Bay Area cannot address the impacts of climate change and what's going to happen, I really don't know what's going to happen in this country, because we do have the resources here, we have the people here, and the people are committed to making something happen. but I'm optimistic because people are committed to making something happen. As I go to hand this off, I want to thank Sophia Douglas, who really put the program together today, and Cameron Carr, for both policy associates with BPC, who worked hand in hand to make this happen today. The program resource book, if you attended our Energy Water Nexus Summit in today's program, obviously you attended that. It's a phenomenal program book, resource book, you want to call it that, that will allow for you to link, hyperlink to different activities, funding sources, information, and everything else. So please use that. And I think we'll go from calling them program books to resource books in the future. And I hope that you appreciate that we changed the dialogue and how we did this in the spring summit and other events. It was yada, yada, yada presentation, no time for dialogue between panelists and speakers, or panelists and panelists. So we heard that, we changed our format, and hope you'd like the new format we have put together. And we'll be doing this approach in the future. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. I want to hand this off now to Laura Kennedy, who is our president of the Bay Plain Coalition Board of Directors and doing a phenomenal job. And with that, Laura, the closing is yours.
Thanks, John. And I'll try to wrap this up quickly. I do want to just start by thanking our speakers. And it was really great to hear from all of you who returned from the Spring Summit, as well as those of you who are new to the conversation. I really enjoyed the new contributions and all the different and diverse perspectives and expertise that you brought to the conversations today. I also want to thank our sponsors who make events like this possible. So please consider sponsoring future events with BPC. You know, as many others have mentioned during the call today or throughout today, that, you know, the hurricane in Florida this week obviously is really the most recent example of climate change. And it really is a call to action. We need to address both current and future impacts of climate change now. But the conversations today really do make me optimistic. From the planning efforts we heard about to the funding, there's implementation of resiliency projects that's underway, as well as acknowledgement of some challenges that still need to be addressed. So I appreciate the open, honest dialogue that this event provided. Circling back to Warner's opening remarks, the Bay Area is an amazing and unique place, and I appreciate everyone that's been on this call for your work in making our region more resilient. We have several additional events planned for the remainder of 2022, and those are listed in your program that John referenced. And really of note, I want to make sure everyone's aware of the reception with Eileen White, who is the new executive director for the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board. And that's coming up next week. So that should be a lot of fun. Hope you all can make that. I encourage all of you to get involved with our committees. There's information about the committees in the program so that you can continue the dialogue and advance the issues that were discussed today. If you are not already a member of BPC, I strongly encourage you to become a member. So please reach out to any of the BPC staff to learn more about the benefits of being a member of BPC. And finally, on behalf of the board of directors, thank you for attending today. And I look forward to seeing all of you at a future BPC event. Thank you.